Come, settle in now. Let the weight of the day begin to soften and release. Let your shoulders find the pillow. Let your breath grow a little slower, a little deeper, because tonight we are going somewhere very old and very far away, and all you need to do is listen, and perhaps, without quite meaning to, drift gently off to sleep. If you find your way back to these stories night after night, the way a traveler finds their way back to a favorite road, you might consider subscribing, so that these quiet journeys are always waiting for you when the day is done and the room has gone still. And if you feel so moved, leave a small word in the comments tonight. Just tell us where in the world you are listening from, because there is something lovely about knowing that somewhere in Oslo, or Nairobi, or a quiet suburb of Melbourne, or a room in Sao Paulo where the ceiling fan turns slowly overhead, someone else is lying in the dark, letting the ancient world wash gently over them, and we are all, in our small way, keeping each other company across the enormous distances of the night. But now, let us go to Rome. Not the Rome of emperors and marble grandeur, not yet, but something earlier and rougher and more alive with its own contradictions. Rome as it was in the years before the birth of Augustus, perhaps 60 or 70 years before the Common Era, when the city was already the largest and most complicated human settlement in the Western world, and yet still carried within it the memory of the small hilltop village it had once been, long, long ago, in a time that even the Romans themselves only half remembered. Imagine the Tiber first, because the river is where everything begins. In the early morning hours, before the sun has fully cleared the hills, the water is a deep and muted green, silvered at its edges, where the light falls in long slanted lines, and the smell of it rises cool and faintly muddy into the air, the smell of silt and slow movement, and things brought down from distant places, timber from the Apennines, grain from the broad flat farmlands to the south, the occasional battered cargo vessel sitting low in the water, crewed by men who have been on the river for so many years that they move across their decks with the unhurried certainty of people who have made their peace with something larger than themselves. The river does not hurry. The river has been here longer than the city, and the river knows it. From the river banks the ground rises, in several directions at once, across the famous 7 hills, though in truth, the hills are less dramatic than the number suggests. They are more like long, gentle swellings of the earth, separated by shallow valleys where the ground grows damp, and the air in summer hangs thick and still and faintly sweet with the smell of the drainage channels that run beneath the streets. Rome was built in a basin essentially, surrounded on all sides by higher ground, and this gave it in those years a particular quality of enclosure, a sense of being held within something larger, of being watched over by the wooded slopes of the Janiculum to the west and the long ridge of the Esquiline to the east, where the city gradually thinned out into market gardens and the white tombs that lined the roads leading away into the countryside. The streets themselves, and this is worth sitting with for a moment, letting it settle into the imagination, were narrow, extraordinarily narrow by any modern measure. In the oldest parts of the city, the streets were barely wide enough for 2 people to pass one another without turning sideways, and they wound between the fronts of tall, close-pressed apartment buildings called insulae, which rose sometimes 4 and 5 stories above the street level, their upper floors projecting slightly outward, so that the strip of sky visible between the rooftops was only a bright, irregular ribbon, shifting from pale gold to deep blue as the hours moved. From those upper floors on warm evenings, people would lean out over the sills and call across to their neighbors in the building opposite, exchanging the small, necessary news of the day, the kind of conversation that is less about information and more about the reassurance of proximity, the comfort of knowing that someone is there, just across the narrow gulf of air, between one wall and another. Lower down, at street level, the city was in almost constant motion during the daylight hours. Roman law, in those years, prohibited wheeled traffic within the city walls during the day, which meant that the streets were given over entirely to people on foot, a dense and endlessly varied river of them, and the sounds they produced were extraordinary in their layering, the slap and scuff of sandals on stone, the cries of street vendors selling hot food from small braziers set up in doorways, the smell of that food drifting outward into the crowd, lentils and spiced wine, and the sharp particular smell of fish sauce, which the Romans put on nearly everything, and which permeated the air of the city the way the smell of bread permeates a bakery, so thoroughly that after a while you ceased to notice it separately, and it simply became part of the smell of Rome itself. The Forum lay at the heart of things, in the low ground between the Palatine and the Capitoline hills, and in these years before the great building programs of the late Republic began to transform it, it retained something of the quality of a very busy, very ancient marketplace, which is in its origins exactly what it had been. The temples that lined its edges were old, some of them very old, their facades darkened with the smoke of generations of offerings, their steps worn smooth by countless feet, their interiors dim and fragrant with incense and the waxy smell of accumulated dedications. Small bronze figurines and votive tablets hung on every available surface, each one representing a private hope or a private gratitude, the accumulated whispered prayers of centuries given physical form, and left to gather dust in the half-darkness of a shrine. In the evenings, the pace of the city changed. The vendors packed away their braziers, the crowds thinned and dispersed, and the Forum settled into a different kind of life, less frenetic, more contemplative. Men of affairs, senators, lawyers, those who conducted the complicated business of a city that governed an empire, would gather in small groups at the edges of the open space, talking in low voices, heads inclined toward one another, hands moving in the small precise gestures of people accustomed to making arguments. The marble of the temple steps, which had been bleached white and almost painful in the direct midday sun, softened in the evening light to something closer to cream or to the pale gold of old honey, and the shadows of the columns lengthened across the paving stones with a slowness that was almost imperceptible, until suddenly you realized the light had gone and the air had cooled, and somewhere above the rooftops the first stars were becoming visible in the deepening blue. Not a peaceful city. Not in those years. The late Republic was a time of extraordinary tension, of civil war and political murder, and the slow, agonizing collapse of institutions that had served Rome for centuries and were no longer adequate to the scale of what Rome had become. The names that filled the streets in those decades were names that have never quite left the human imagination. Sulla, Marius, Crassus, Pompey, Caesar, men of colossal ambition moving through a world that seemed almost too small to contain them, and the ordinary life of the city going on around them, the street vendors, and the river bargemen, and the women leaning from their upper windows, continuing its ancient rhythms, even as the world above it shook and tilted and remade itself. And somewhere in all of this, somewhere in the texture of this loud and vivid and dangerous and beautiful city, a future was being prepared. Not consciously, not deliberately. Cities do not prepare futures the way a craftsman prepares a piece of work, but in the way that weather is prepared, in the slow accumulation of conditions, in the particular combination of this ground and this air and this water and this people at this moment in history, something was becoming possible that had never been possible before. The long Roman twilight was settling over the Republic, and in its cooling light, though no one knew it yet, the age of Augustus was already beginning to take shape. For now, though, let the river hold you. Let the Tiber move through the dark as it has always moved, carrying its cargo of silt and memory and slow green water southward toward the sea. The city rests around you, its sounds diminishing into the deep quiet of the Roman night, its torches burning low in their iron brackets, their small flames the only moving things in all that stillness. Tomorrow we will go a little south of Rome, into the low hills of the Volscian countryside, to a modest town called Velitrae, where a family of local standing is going about its ordinary life, knowing nothing yet of what that life is about to mean to the world. But that is for another moment. For now, only rest. The hills above Velitrae hold the light differently in the early morning, when the mist has not yet burned away, and the olive groves stand silver and still against the pale sky. And it is somewhere in that quietness, in the soft gray hour before the countryside fully wakens, that we find the beginning of this story. Not in a palace, not in the marble corridors of Rome, but in a small town in the Alban Hills, where the air smells of wood smoke and turned earth, and the particular sweetness of Italian autumn, and where a family of middling comfort and considerable pride was putting down, season by season, the quiet roots from which something extraordinary would eventually grow. The town of Velitrae was not a place that history paid much attention to, and perhaps that was part of its charm. a small Volscian settlement that had long since made its peace with Roman rule, sitting on its gentle ridge above the surrounding farmland, its streets narrow and unhurried, its forum modest and provincial, its people the kind of solid, serious Italians who kept their accounts carefully and their ambitions carefully measured. It was the kind of place where a man of the equestrian class, that middle rank of Roman society, neither senators nor common tradesmen, but something respectable and capable in between, could live well and be regarded well, and feel on a clear morning looking south toward the sea that life had arranged itself into a reasonable and dignified shape. Into this world in the 63rd year before the birth of Christ, Gaius Octavius Thurinus came into being, a small, unremarkable beginning for a life that would eventually become the measure by which all other Roman lives were judged. His father, also Gaius Octavius, was a man of genuine ability who had risen through the traditional offices of Roman public life with a quiet steadiness that spoke of both talent and patience, eventually serving as a praetor and then as governor of the province of Macedonia, where by all accounts he performed his duties with a conscientiousness that earned him a solid, unhurried reputation. He was not a man of great wealth or ancient family connection, but he was serious and capable, and he understood that in Rome seriousness and capability, applied with sufficient patience, could carry a man a considerable distance. The mother was Attia, and here the story begins to bend towards something larger, because Attia was the niece of Julius Caesar, that great restless world-altering figure, who was at that very period in the early years of the boy's childhood, beginning his long climb toward the kind of power that would eventually fracture the Republic entirely. It is worth pausing for a moment on that connection, not dramatizing it, simply holding it gently in mind, the way you might hold a stone found on a path, and feel its weight and texture before understanding what it is. Because the fact of Attia and of Caesar beyond her cast a long, slow light over the child's earliest years, even when those years were outwardly nothing more than the ordinary rhythms of a Roman boy's upbringing in a provincial town. Of those earliest years, the record is fragmentary and partial, as it so often is for the childhoods of even the most famous Romans, and what survives is a mixture of genuine memory, later idealization, and the kind of pleasing legend that tends to gather around a remarkable life once that life has become the object of public reverence. It is said, for instance, that even before his birth, there were signs. The story goes that his father dreamed the sun rose from Attia's womb, a dream of the kind that ancient biographers love to preserve, because it confirmed what everyone looking backward could already see. Whether we take such things as literal prophecy, or simply as the way a culture reaches backward and tries to make sense of greatness, they have their own kind of beauty, and we need not dismiss them to let them rest lightly in the mind. What seems clearer and more grounded is the texture of the childhood itself, the household in Velitrae, the smell of oil lamps in the early morning, the feel of terracotta tiles underfoot in summer, the sound of his mother's voice directing the business of a Roman family, with the particular combination of warmth and firmness that the Roman matron ideal both prescribed and, in the best cases, genuinely embodied. Attia appears in the later sources as a woman of real character, careful, devout, attentive to her children's education and moral formation in a way that went beyond mere social obligation. She raised the boy with an eye toward what he might become, not in any grandiose or forcing way, but with the quiet insistence of someone who understood that character was built slowly, in the ordinary hours of ordinary days, and that the habits formed in childhood were the ones a man carried for the rest of his life. His father was present for only a portion of those early years. Gaius Octavius the Elder died when the boy was only 4 years old, a loss that must have settled like a cool shadow over the household, though the child would have been too young to carry a conscious grief, and would have known the world only as the world already was, with that absence already woven into its fabric. After his father's death, the boy came for a time under the care of his maternal grandmother Julia, Caesar's sister, another woman of quiet strength and evident capability. And then, when Attia remarried, into a household that added the figure of a stepfather, Lucius Marcius Philippus, a man of considerable standing, who seems to have regarded his stepson with a kind of cautious, benevolent distance, neither pushing him forward nor holding him back. The education that followed was the education of a Roman boy of good family. The long, careful instruction in Greek and Latin letters, in rhetoric and philosophy, in the physical disciplines of riding and swimming and the management of the body that Roman aristocratic culture considered inseparable from the management of the mind. It is said that he was a diligent student, not necessarily the most naturally brilliant in the room, but possessed of an extraordinary capacity for sustained, careful effort. The kind of intelligence that does not flame up suddenly and dazzle everyone around it, but instead works quietly and methodically, building its understanding the way a craftsman builds a wall, stone by stone, testing each one before moving to the next. There is a story, preserved in the biography, written much later by Suetonius, that, at the age of 12, the boy delivered the funeral eulogy for his grandmother Julia in the Forum, standing before the assembled crowd with a composure and precision that struck those present as remarkable for one so young. Whether the speech itself was entirely his own composition or had been shaped by tutors and family advisors, the fact that he stood there and delivered it with sufficient authority to be remembered suggests something about the quality of presence he was already developing. That particular stillness and self-containment that would later be one of the most remarked upon features of the man he was becoming. All through these years, the great figure of Caesar moved at the periphery of the boy's awareness, a great uncle who was becoming year by year the most consequential Roman of his generation, waging his wars in Gaul, remaking the map of the world in the slow, methodical way that military genius combined with political cunning makes possible. The connection between that enormous distant figure and the quiet household in the Alban Hills was real, but not yet fully activated, not yet drawn tight. It was simply there, a thread in the weave of the family's life, waiting for the moment when circumstances and intention would begin to pull it taut. For now, though, the boy grew, slowly, carefully, in the way that things grow in the hill country, where the winters are long and the light comes back by increments, and the olive trees put down their roots over decades before they are ready to bear. He was slight in build, it is said, and not especially robust in health, prone to the kind of physical fragility that would follow him all his life and make his eventual achievements seem all the more improbable, and yet possessed even then of something in the eyes and bearing that people around him seemed to notice without quite being able to name, a quality of attention and intention that suggested a mind already engaged in some long, patient project of its own. And beyond the windows of whatever room the child sat in, reading his Greek texts or reciting his rhetorical exercises, the Italian hills rolled away into the distance, and the wind moved through the olive groves in long silver waves, and Rome, enormous, complicated, restless Rome, waited at the end of the road, not yet fully aware of what was making its unhurried way toward it. Let that image rest with you now, the hills, the groves, the child at his studies, the great city waiting, and let yourself grow still and easy, breathing quietly, because in the next chapter, that distant, enormous figure of Caesar will begin to draw a little closer, and the shape of things will slowly, gently, begin to become clear. Somewhere in the city, a lamp was being lit. You can almost see it. A small clay vessel filled with olive oil, a wick of twisted flax catching the flame from a taper held in a careful hand, and the warm orange light spreading slowly across a wall, across the grain of a wooden table, across the face of someone settling in for the evening. This is how Rome illuminated itself in those years, lamp by lamp, flame by flame, each little fire a quiet declaration that the night had arrived, and that human life would continue within it, unhurried, in pools of amber warmth. It is how we will follow this story too, gently, one small light at a time, moving now into the years of a boy's growing up, and into the long, careful shadow that began to fall across that growing from a very great distance indeed. The boy was Gaius Octavius, and he was perhaps 4 or 5 years old when Julius Caesar first began to exist in his awareness. Not as a man known personally, not as an uncle met across a dinner table or heard speaking in a courtyard, but as a name that the adults around him said in a particular way, with a particular weight, the way one speaks of weather that is very far off, but moving closer. Caesar was his great-uncle by blood, through the marriage of Caesar's sister Julia to a man named Gaius Octavius the Elder, the boy's grandfather. It was a connection close enough to matter in Rome's deeply genealogical society. And yet, at that early stage, it was little more than a thread, thin and untested, stretching across the distance between a modest family in the Velitrae hills and one of the most consequential men in the known world. Caesar, in those years, was not yet the figure history would ultimately make of him. He was powerful, certainly, a man who had served as consul, who had commanded in Spain, who was already gathering the political momentum that would eventually carry him far beyond anything the old republic had been designed to contain. But he was also simply a Roman aristocrat of enormous energy and ambition, and like all such men, he was aware of his family connections and attentive to those who might one day reflect well or poorly upon the name he carried. It is said that he noticed the boy from Velitrae at some point during Octavius's early childhood, though the precise occasion is lost to us. What we do know is that the connection began slowly, as such things tend to when one party is a child and the other is perpetually preoccupied with the affairs of a restless and fractious world. There is something worth pausing to feel here, in the texture of that early attention. Imagine the boy, small and likely still subject to the various ailments that seemed to follow him throughout his childhood, aware in the particular way that children are aware of being watched by someone important. Not frightened, perhaps, but attentive, alert. The quality of attention that Caesar turned on people was, by all accounts, remarkable. He was a man who remembered names, who asked precise questions, who made individuals feel that they had been truly seen, rather than merely noticed. To have such attention directed at oneself as a child, from someone of Caesar's stature, must have been both strange and quietly thrilling, like standing near a fire whose warmth is pleasant, but whose capacity for heat one is not yet quite old enough to understand. Caesar had no legitimate son. This was a fact that sat beneath the surface of Roman political life in those years, like a stone beneath shallow water, present, significant, impossible to simply wish away. He had a daughter, Julia, beloved and by all accounts extraordinary. But she had died in childbirth in the year the boy Octavius was about 6 years old. And with her death, something in Caesar's dynastic calculations shifted and continued slowly shifting through the years that followed. He was a man who built things, alliances, campaigns, monuments, reputations, and the question of who might eventually inherit what he had built was never entirely absent from his thinking. It is said that he watched young Octavius with this in mind, though it would be too simple to suggest that the relationship between them was ever merely transactional, a great man inspecting a potential heir the way one might inspect a promising colt. What the ancient sources suggest, gently and somewhat imprecisely, is that the relationship deepened by degrees across the years of the boy's middle childhood and early adolescence, finding its shape in the small occasions that Roman family life provided. There were festivals and public ceremonies at which a great-uncle and his young relative might stand near one another, where the boy might be positioned at Caesar's side in some minor formal capacity, learning by proximity how power conducted itself in public, how it moved, how it held its face, how it acknowledged lesser men without condescension, and peers without weakness. There were meals, probably, at which the great man spoke and the boy listened, absorbing the rhythms of conversation at the highest levels of Roman society, beginning to understand that words were instruments as much as swords, and that a man who commanded both could command very nearly anything. When Octavius was about 9 years old, he stood and delivered the funeral oration for his grandmother Julia, Caesar's sister, and did so apparently with a composure and a quality of presence that people noticed and remembered. This was the Roman world, and the Roman world was always watching its young men for signs of what they might become. To speak well at a funeral, to hold grief at arm's length long enough to honor the dead with eloquence, was considered not coldness, but a form of virtue, self-possession in the service of duty. Whether Caesar was present to hear the boy speak is not certain, but the story was clearly told and retold in the circles around them both, and it is not difficult to imagine it reaching his ears and settling there with a certain quiet satisfaction. The boy grew. The ailments that troubled his childhood were persistent, and there is something quietly remarkable about the fact that a constitution so apparently fragile would eventually carry a man through more than 7 decades of life, through war and crisis, and the sustained strain of governing an empire. But in those boyhood years, the fragility was real, and it meant that Octavius spent portions of his growing up at rest, in shaded rooms, with the light coming in at a slant, and the sounds of the household moving softly around him. The footsteps of slaves on stone floors, the distant clatter of the kitchen, the occasional drift of smoke from the small lamp on its stand near the doorway. Illness, when it is not overwhelming, can be its own kind of education. It teaches patience. It teaches the value of stillness. It teaches a child to observe from the margins while others move freely through the center of things, and the observer, so formed, often becomes very skilled indeed at understanding what they see. Caesar, in these same years, was engaged in the enormous project of the Gallic campaigns, gone for long seasons at a time into the cold and unfamiliar north, crossing rivers and cutting through forests, and bringing enormous portions of the world gradually under Roman dominion. He wrote about it, famously, in clear, clean prose that was itself a kind of campaign, a shaping of his own story, a careful presentation of each decision as reasonable and each victory as earned. That the boy in Velitrae and later in Rome was reading this prose, or hearing it read, and absorbing the voice of the man who cast his shadow across the household, seems likely. Caesar was already a legend while alive, and the young Octavius was being raised, by degrees, in the awareness that this legend was also, in some precise biological sense, family. By the time Octavius entered his early teenage years, the relationship had become something more formal and deliberate. Caesar began to involve him in small ways in his civic life, ensuring the boy received the proper marks of status and attention, easing his path toward the kinds of honors and positions that Roman society reserved for those it had already decided to take seriously. The connection was still developing, still finding its final shape, but its direction was now clear enough to be felt by those watching closely from the outside, even if the two at its center moved through it with the careful unhurriedness of people who understand that the best structures are built slowly, stone upon stone, each layer set to dry before the next is placed. And so the evenings would come, as Roman evenings always came, with the gradual softening of the light and the appearance of the lamps one by one across the city and the surrounding hills. Small flames steadied themselves against the dark, each one a world of warmth held within its own small radius. The boy grew, and the great man returned from his campaigns, and the thread between them grew thicker, more deliberate, more weighted with everything that was yet to come. The city itself seemed to wait in those lamplit evenings, as if it understood, though of course it understood nothing, that what was forming between an old man's ambition and a young one's stillness would one day determine the shape of the world for centuries. Rest now, and let the lamps burn low. Tomorrow we will walk together through those streets, and feel the evening air settle across the forum, and listen to the sound of Rome itself, breathing at the close of another long day. The light is going now, the long afternoon light that has lain all day across the city like a warm hand pressed flat against the stone, and it is drawing itself back slowly, the way a tide draws back from a shore, reluctant, trailing, leaving everything it touched a little changed by the contact. Rome at this hour is not yet dark and not yet quiet. It lives in the in-between, in that long amber suspension between the business of day and the deep blue business of night. And if you were to stand very still somewhere on the slope of the Capitoline Hill and simply let the city come to you, you would understand something about this place that no history book has ever quite managed to capture, because it is not a thing that can be captured, only felt, only breathed in, the way you might breathe in the smell of rain before the rain has actually arrived. The smoke comes first. It is always the smoke you notice before anything else, because in this city of 1,000,000 souls or something near to it, everyone is cooking at once in the long golden tail of the afternoon, and the smoke rises from 10,000 small fires, from braziers set in the open fronts of cookshops, from the clay ovens behind the tabernae, from the little hearths in the apartments stacked 4 and 5 stories up in the insulae, where families crowd together in the gathering warmth, and all this smoke mingles in the air above the streets and rooftops into a single soft haze that gives the whole city a slightly dreaming quality, as though Rome itself is drifting, as though it is half asleep already and still pretending to be awake. Below the smoke in the streets themselves, the smell is something else entirely, and it is not a gentle thing, The streets of the late Republic are narrow and close, and they carry in their stones and in the air above them the accumulated presence of the million people who have walked them and lived beside them and cast their waste into them over the long course of a day that began before the sun rose. There is the smell of horses and mules, of the heavy transport wagons that have been rumbling through the city since dawn and will rumble through it again once the light has finally gone. There is the iron and leather smell of a soldier passing, and the complex breathing cloud of herbs and old wool and cooking oil that surrounds a woman carrying a basket from the market. And underneath it all, beneath everything, the particular warm, ancient smell of stone that has been in the sun all day and is now releasing its warmth back into the cooling air. The smell that is perhaps closer than any other to the true smell of Rome, irreducible, permanent, the smell of the city itself. The Forum lies at the heart of all of this, the low ground between the hills, where the life of the Republic gathers and turns and gathers again. And at this hour, in the long, slow dusk, it is beginning to empty itself of the urgency that fills it through the middle of the day. The advocates who have been arguing their cases with enormous passion and volume all afternoon are gathering their documents now, their scrolls rolled and tucked, their voices dropping from performance to conversation, and they stand in small clusters near the rostra, the great curved platform from which the orators of Rome have addressed the people for generations. And their talk is lower now, and more personal, and the gestures that punctuated their arguments all day are softer, the arms lowering, the fingers quieting. The rostra itself stands in the last of the light, and the light on it is extraordinary. The stone has been warmed by decades of hands and feet and weather into a smoothness that catches the low-angled sun and holds it. And the bronze prows of the ships captured long ago in battles at sea and fixed there as trophies catch the light differently, harder and more golden. And the whole structure at this hour seems to glow from within, as though it has been absorbing sunlight all day in order to give it back now, gently, to whoever happens to be standing near it in the dusk. Behind the rostra, the temples arrange themselves on the slope of the Capitoline and along the edges of the Forum floor, and each of them in this light seems to be doing something slightly different with the last of the sun. The Temple of Saturn, old and heavy and enormous, drinks the light into its dark stones and seems to grow more solid as the day diminishes, more permanent, as though it is quietly reminding everyone nearby that it has stood for a very long time and intends to stand for considerably longer. The Temple of Castor and Pollux, more slender and white, takes the same light and does something livelier with it, catching it on the flutes of its columns, so that each column is striped with alternating gold and shadow. And from a certain angle, and at a certain moment, the whole temple appears to be very gently breathing. The sounds of the Forum at this hour have changed from the sounds of midday. The shouting that fills the square in the earlier hours, the arguments and transactions and political haranguing and simple human loudness of a city at full pitch, has softened into something more complex and layered, a sound you might compare to a river heard from a little distance, where individual voices are no longer quite distinct, but merge into a continuous presence, a hum that is warm and alive, and somehow comforting in its suggestion of collective existence. Somewhere across the Forum a water seller is calling, and his call has become so automatic after a day of repetition that it floats above the general sound like a bird call, patterned and musical, and only half intentional. Dogs pick their way between the feet of the departing crowd with the practiced confidence of animals who have lived their whole lives in cities and understand the rhythms of crowds better than most people do. Pigeons are settling on the cornices of the temples in their shifting, murmuring clouds, and their sound joins the general sound of the place and softens it further. Walk a little away from the Forum now, along one of the streets that lead up toward the residential quarters, and notice how the city changes character with every few dozen steps. The great public spaces give way to the smaller, more personal geography of the neighborhood, the street shrinking, the buildings on either side pressing closer and leaning slightly toward one another overhead, so that the strip of sky above the street narrows to something like a crack of pale blue going quickly to gray, and the light down here at ground level is already something between dusk and early dark. The oil lamps are appearing in doorways and windows, small warm flames behind their clay and bronze shields, and they give the stone walls around them a moving, breathing quality, as the tiny amount of evening air that moves through the street makes each flame shiver slightly, and the shadows shiver with it. From behind a wall somewhere near, the sound of water, a fountain in a courtyard, its steady fall completely unchanged by the coming of evening, pouring now exactly as it poured at noon, and as it will pour in the full dark of midnight, because water in this city does not observe the human calendar of day and night. It is always itself, always the same voice, and in the dusk it becomes more audible, because the other sounds around it are subsiding, and you can hear it clearly, the small bright voice of the water in the cooling air. Further up the hill, the great houses of the wealthy begin, their walls higher and less revealing than those of the streets below, their gates closed, their courtyards hidden, but from over their walls comes sometimes the smell of the garden, the particular complex sweetness of rosemary and box and old roses that is the smell of a Roman garden in the early evening, and it drifts out over the wall and into the street and mingles there with the smoke from the cookshops lower down, and the stone warmth rising from the road underfoot. And in this mingling, it becomes something greater than itself, becomes one thread in the full texture of the city at this hour. This is the city as it has been for a generation now, gathering itself in the long evenings of a republic that is older than anyone alive can quite remember, and more troubled than most people are willing yet to say aloud. It is a city of extraordinary beauty and tremendous noise and great human warmth and considerable cruelty and an intelligence about itself that is always just on the edge of becoming wisdom, and sometimes does, and sometimes does not. And somewhere in it tonight, in one of these streets or houses, a boy is growing, eating his dinner perhaps, watching a lamp flame perhaps, and the city around him is shaping him, as surely as any teacher or lesson, pressing its particular genius into him through the simple fact of daily presence, its smoke and light and stone, and the sound of its water, finding their way into the memory, where they will remain, quietly, always. The flames in the doorways burn on steadily, as the dark deepens and settles over the hills, and on the other side of a great deal of restless water, in the province of Macedonia, a young man of 18 is also watching the light go, and very soon a piece of news will cross that water to find him, and nothing will be the same for him or for this city afterward. But that is for another night, and for now, the lamp flame is enough, and the city breathes, and the dark comes gently. The water moves differently at night, or so it seems when you are lying close to a foreign shore, listening to the Adriatic breathe in the darkness beyond the tent walls. There is something in the sound of it, that patient, unhurried shifting of weight against the land that makes the world feel very large and very still at once, as though the sea itself is waiting for something it has not yet been told. In the early months of the year that the Romans counted as the 710th since the founding of their city, a young man was camped near the town of Apollonia, on the eastern shore of that same sea, learning the arts of war in the measured, deliberate way that his great-uncle Julius Caesar had arranged. He was 18 years old, or nearly so. He was not tall, or so the later writers would record, and he had been unwell for much of his short life, a constitution that seemed to resist the very ambitions quietly forming within it. Yet there was something about him, something in the steadiness of his gray eyes and the patience with which he observed the world around him, that made older men notice him, and more rarely feel a faint and inexplicable unease in his presence. His name was still Gaius Octavius, though in the common way of things he was often called Octavian, and he had come to Macedonia to study, to train, to place himself in the slow current of Caesar's plans for a great eastern campaign against the Parthian kingdom. He had studied rhetoric already, had sat at the feet of learned men, had practiced the forms and cadences of argument with the same careful attention he gave to everything. And now he was learning the other language, the language of soldiers, of formations and supply lines, and the particular patience required to lead men who carry swords. Apollonia itself was a Greek city, old in the way that eastern cities are old, with colonnaded streets and the smell of olive oil pressing from the mills, and the sound of the sea arriving in long, slow syllables against the harbor stones. The evenings there would have carried that particular softness that belongs to places near warm water, a cooling of the air, a faint salt on the back of the throat, the lamps beginning to appear in doorways and along the quays like small rehearsals for the stars gathering overhead. He would have sat in such evenings, we imagine, with his friends. Marcus Agrippa was there, solid and loyal and entirely without the complications of doubt. And there were others, young men drawn into the orbit of Caesar's heir apparent, learning their futures alongside him. They would have spoken of the coming campaign, perhaps, or of Rome, which was 4 or 5 days' sail to the west, and which existed for all of them as a kind of radiant imagined place, even for those who had lived their whole lives in its noise and shadow. And then the messengers came. It is said that the news arrived first in fragments, the way terrible news often travels, a rumor carried by a sailor, a whispered account from someone who had heard something in a port, the pieces assembling themselves slowly into a shape too large to look at directly. Caesar was dead. Julius Caesar, dictator of Rome, his great-uncle, his patron, the man who had looked at this quiet, watchful boy and seen something worth the name of heir. Caesar had been killed in the theater of Pompeii on the Ides of March, stabbed by a group of senators who believed they were restoring the Republic and had instead torn open the world. More than 20 wounds, the story goes. He had fallen at the foot of Pompey's statue, and his blood had spread across the marble floor of a city that had loved him and feared him, and was now, in the space of a single afternoon, utterly without him. What Octavian felt in those first hours, no ancient source can tell us with certainty. The feelings of 18-year-olds in their private moments are not the things that history tends to preserve. But we can sit with him a little in the imagination, can picture the lamp still burning in whatever room or tent he occupied, the sound of the Adriatic continuing its patient work outside, indifferent to the news it had carried westward, the smell of the sea unchanged and unhurried while everything else rearranged itself into a new and dangerous configuration. He had lost someone. Whatever the political calculus, whatever the inheritance at stake, he had lost the man who had chosen him, who had seen him, and that particular grief, the grief of being seen and then losing the one who saw you, is not something that ambition can entirely absorb or disguise. His mother Attia sent word urging caution. His stepfather Philippus sent similar counsel. Come quietly, come privately, come without drawing attention to yourself, because the men who had killed Caesar were still in Rome, still armed with the rhetoric of liberty, still capable of killing again. The sensible thing, the thing that a cautious person, a person who valued his own skin above all considerations would do, was to accept that the inheritance would likely be contested or dissolved, to let the name Caesar pass to someone older and more powerful, to return to Rome as a private citizen and live a careful, unremarkable life. There was, by any reasonable assessment, very little waiting for him across the water, only danger. He decided to go. The decision, as best we can read it from the account of later historians and from the logic of events, was not made in a single dramatic moment of blazing resolution. It was made the way that certain deep decisions are made, slowly, in the dark, with the sound of water nearby, letting the various possibilities settle until only one remained that the self could honestly recognize as its own. He would cross to Italy. He would go to Brundisium, the great port on the heel of the peninsula where the Adriatic journey ended. He would learn what had been left to him in Caesar's will, which he did not yet know in full, and he would, depending on what he found, consider whether to accept the name and the inheritance and everything that came with them. His companions worried. Agrippa worried in his practical, undemonstrative way. Others in the camp counseled delay, counseled waiting to see how the situation in Rome resolved itself. Counseled the simple wisdom of not placing an 18-year-old body between the contending forces of the most powerful state in the known world. Octavian listened. He had always been a good listener, and he sailed. The crossing of the Adriatic in those spring days would have been unremarkable by the standards of seasoned travelers, though to cross any stretch of open water is always a small surrender to forces larger than oneself. The wind making its own decisions, the light on the waves moving in ways that have nothing to do with human plans. He went with a small number of companions, keeping his arrival as quiet as the circumstances allowed. When he reached the Italian shore, when he felt the solid, particular earth of his own peninsula under his feet again, he began to ask questions and to listen to the answers with that same steady, unhurried attention that would define every important thing he ever did. What he learned at Brundisium confirmed the magnitude of what had been set in motion. Caesar's will, already read publicly in Rome, named him as primary heir. The name Caesar was his, if he chose to accept it. The fortune was his, or would be, if he could claim it. The soldiers who had served under Caesar, and who were now uncertain and unsettled in the aftermath of the killing. Their loyalties were available to whoever presented the most legitimate claim to their dead general's legacy. All of this was waiting. All of it was also very genuinely an invitation to be murdered. He began to walk north, not in haste, not with armies, not with proclamations, but quietly through the warm Italian spring, through towns where Caesar's veterans lived on their land grants and remembered their commander, and looked with particular interest at this thin young man who carried the great name so carefully, like something he had not yet decided how to hold. They came out to meet him in those towns, it is said, soldiers who had followed Caesar across Gaul and into civil war, men with old wounds and long memories, men who understood without being told that the boy in front of them was the nearest thing to continuation that the world now offered them. And so Gaius Octavius, walking northward through the olive-scented air of an Italian spring, began, one careful step at a time, to become Caesar. The road stretched ahead through the lengthening days, and the sea that had carried him home settled back into its own deep rhythms behind him, its voice fading as the distance grew, murmuring as it always murmurs, patient, continuous, entirely unaware of the history it had helped to set in motion. While somewhere ahead Rome waited, bright and dangerous and full of wolves, and a young man walked quietly toward it with all the time in the world and none at all. The coast of Brundisium appears slowly through sea haze, the way all momentous things tend to appear, not with fanfare, not with a sudden revelation, but as a gradual solidifying out of the pale morning air, a darkening of the horizon that becomes by degrees the stone and soil of Italy. The water is still. Gulls move above the harbor mouth in long, unhurried arcs, crying to no one in particular, and somewhere on the dock a rope is coiled and a sail is being furled, and the ordinary business of arrival continues as it has always continued, indifferent to the significance of what it carries. A young man steps ashore. He is not yet 19 years old. He is slight of build, and the crossing has been a long one, and he carries in his name, his new name, the one he has decided to keep, something that is both a shield and a target, a thing that might protect him, and might also, on any given morning, be the reason a knife finds him. He is called Gaius Julius Caesar now, or he is choosing to be called that, which in Rome amounts to nearly the same thing. The will has been read, the adoption is posthumous, and its legal standing is something the lawyers will argue over for years. But Octavian, and let us use the name we know him by, the one history will settle upon, even though he himself rarely used it, Octavian has decided that the name belongs to him, and he has decided this with the quiet, irrevocable certainty of someone who has done the arithmetic of the moment and found only one possible answer. To refuse the inheritance would be to be nobody. To accept it is to be everything, or to be dead while trying. The road north from Brundisium runs through a landscape that is already warm with the beginning of an Italian spring, the fields edging toward green, the old stone walls of the Via Appia worn smooth by centuries of feet and wheels and the slow patience of weather. He travels with a modest company, friends, a small retinue, nothing that announces itself as an army or a procession. This is deliberate. He has already understood, with a clarity that might seem remarkable in someone his age, and yet which seems to have arrived in him fully formed, like a muscle he was born with and has simply never had occasion to use until now, that the art of this particular moment is restraint, to arrive quietly, to speak carefully, to let the name do its work without pushing it too hard, too fast, into spaces that are not yet ready to receive it, because the spaces are occupied. Mark Antony is in Rome, and Antony is large in every sense that matters in those first weeks of spring, large in his physical presence, large in his control of Caesar's papers and Caesar's funds, large in the army he commands and the veterans he can call upon. Antony was Caesar's lieutenant, Caesar's colleague, Caesar's trusted second, and he has spent the weeks since the Ides of March, positioning himself as Caesar's primary heir in all but the technical sense. He has given the funeral oration, he has moved the crowd, he has acquired the papers, he has, in short, been behaving as a man who expects to inherit the earth, and then a 19-year-old walks off a boat in Brundisium with a dead man's name, and everything becomes considerably more complicated. It is said that when word reached Antony that young Octavian had come to Italy and was calling himself Caesar, Antony's initial response was something close to contempt, the dismissal of an older, battle-hardened, politically seasoned man for someone he regarded as a boy, a student, a slight thing the real world had not yet had occasion to break. This contempt, which Antony would maintain for longer than was wise, was in some ways Octavian's first and most useful weapon. To be underestimated at the beginning is an extraordinary gift if you have the patience and the nerve to make use of it. And Octavian, as it would become clear over the months and years that followed, had both in measures that were almost inhuman in their steadiness. He makes his way toward Rome. He stops in towns along the route, and the story goes that in these towns he is received with warmth. That Caesar's veterans, many of them settled on land grants across the countryside, come out to look at him, and that what they see does not disappoint. There is something about him, something that resists easy description, but that the sources return to again and again, a composure, a stillness, a sense that the person in front of you is not performing anything, but is simply entirely present. He has Caesar's name, and he has a face that the veterans find themselves willing to believe belongs to Caesar's line, and he is saying, quietly and carefully, that he intends to honor Caesar's will, including the personal bequest of 300 sestertii that Caesar had left to each Roman citizen, a promise Antony has been conspicuously slow to fulfill. This is important. Money is always important, but the promise of it, spoken in the right voice at the right moment to the right audiences, is sometimes more important than the money itself. Octavian is learning this, or perhaps he already knows it. It is difficult at this distance of 2,000 years to say with confidence where his instincts end and his calculations begin. What is clear is that they tend in these early months to point in the same direction, and that he follows them. Rome itself receives him strangely. The city is a place of competing griefs and competing hopes, and a great deal of barely suppressed anxiety, as it has been since the Ides of March turned the ordinary world upside down. The optimates, the old senatorial families who had supported the assassins, or at least not opposed them, look at Octavian with wariness. He carries a dangerous name and speaks of honoring a man they helped to kill. The Caesarians look at him with a kind of cautious hope, mixed with territorial suspicion, because he is claiming a place in a hierarchy that others have already begun to occupy. Cicero, old and brilliant and profoundly misjudging the situation, sees in Octavian a possible tool, a young man who might be used against Antony and then discarded when no longer needed. He is famously reported to have said of the boy that he should be praised, honored, and then removed, a witticism that would, in retrospect, tell you everything you needed to know about who was underestimating whom. Octavian meets with Antony. The meetings are formal, strained, unproductive in the obvious ways, and deeply instructive in the less obvious ones. Antony will not release the funds. Antony treats the young man with the elaborate patience of someone who expects the problem to resolve itself by going away. And Octavian, for his part, looks back across the table and says what he needs to say and makes note of everything, and goes away not discouraged, but thinking, steadily and at length, about the distance between where he is and where he needs to be, and about what paths might run between those 2 points. He begins to pay the bequests himself, borrowing money, drawing on his own inheritance, spending in order to be seen spending, to demonstrate that he is Caesar's heir not merely in name, but in the distribution of Caesar's generosity, in the keeping of Caesar's word to the ordinary people of Rome. This is expensive. It is also, in the long arithmetic of Roman politics, exactly the right investment. The veterans notice, the citizens notice, and Cicero, who is still composing his thunderous speeches against Antony, his Philippics, looks at young Octavian and decides he might be useful after all, which is the closest the old man ever comes to understanding that he has already, without quite realizing it, lost the game. What Octavian is doing in these months is something that requires enormous nerve, because the simplest description of this situation is that he is alone, or nearly so, in a city full of people who wish him well only insofar as he might serve their own interests, and that the wrong word, the wrong gesture, the wrong alliance formed, or refused at the wrong moment, could at any point bring all of it to a sudden end. He is walking a road that has no map. He is surviving, day by day, by a combination of intelligence and restraint and a quality that is perhaps hardest to name. a capacity for bearing uncertainty without letting it show, for sitting with the not yet knowing while appearing to be entirely, serenely sure. The lamp burns low in the room where he sits, reading letters, receiving messengers, making his careful calculations in the hush of a Roman evening. The city breathes around him, enormous and complicated and not yet his, though somewhere in the quality of the night air, there is perhaps the first faint intimation of what it might one day become. He sets the letters down. He rests. Soon the world around him will grow even more complex. More voices, more dangers, more arrangements to be made among men who trust each other, only as far as shared interest will carry them. But that is a thing for another night, and there is nothing in the lamplight now but the quiet flicker of a flame, finding its steadiness, burning on. The autumn mist had settled over the valley of the Lavinius River, like a breath held too long, and somewhere in that gray, suspended morning, 3 men were walking toward one another across a small island in the middle of a shallow stream, each carrying the weight of what Rome had become and the heavier weight of what they each wished it to be. It was the year 43 before the birth of Christ, and the world that had once revolved around the singular burning certainty of Julius Caesar had, in the 18 months since his death, tilted and shivered and fractured into competing orbits. Marcus Antonius, Antony held the northern provinces and the loyalty of Caesar's veterans, that vast, breathing inheritance of men who had marched through Gaul and crossed the Rubicon and still wore their devotion to the name Caesar like armor next to the skin. Marcus Aemilius Lepidus commanded legions in the south and west, a man of enormous inherited dignity and somewhat less decisive character, steady as old timber, useful in the way that a solid door is useful, not for what it does, but for what it keeps in place. And there was the young man, not yet 21 years old, who had spent the better part of a year doing what no one had quite believed he could do, surviving. Octavian, for that is still what we may call him in this season of his life, had come to this meeting on the island near Bononia, having already demonstrated something that neither Antony nor Lepidus had initially credited him with, which was a patience so cold and so disciplined it could be mistaken if one was not paying close attention for simple youth. He had raised armies, negotiated with the Senate, fought a brief and inconclusive war against Antony himself at Mutina, and then, with the Senate having used him, and then, as the story goes, begun to discuss setting him aside, he had turned and walked back across the space between enemies and opened a conversation. It is said that he crossed the river to the island on foot, waiting, to show that he feared neither the meeting nor the men he was meeting. Whether this is strictly true or merely the kind of detail that gathers around a remarkable life like moss on old stone, it carries a certain truth about his temperament, deliberate, composed, unbothered by the theater of power, so long as the substance of it was moving in the right direction. The 3 men talked for 2 days on that small island, and what they agreed upon was formalized shortly afterward by the passage of the Lex Titia, making them triumvirs, 3 men sharing the governance of the Roman world between them, for a period of 5 years, each holding a portion of the provinces, each commanding legions, together constituting something that was neither the old republic, nor yet the thing Rome would eventually become, but a raw and provisional arrangement hammered together in the way that desperate structures are always hammered together with whatever is at hand in the hope that it holds. The division of the world was this. Antony would hold Gaul, that great green northern region that had made Caesar's reputation, and still felt his absence like an old wound. Lepidus would receive Spain and a part of Gaul beyond the mountains. Octavian would take Africa, Sardinia, and Sicily, the southern and western pieces, as sea-facing territories, and with them, the particular problem of Sextus Pompey, who was even then moving his ships through the waters of that sea, like a shadow that could not quite be grasped. It was, if one is honest about it, a somewhat unequal distribution dressed in the language of agreement. But Octavian had looked at it with those steady eyes, and seen what it offered, room and time, and the slow accumulation of credibility. There is a part of this story, however, that cannot be softened entirely, and which we may approach here in the only way that befits a quiet night, not with horror, but with the sober recognition that power in the ancient world was purchased with a currency we would not today willingly name: the proscriptions. The 3 men, before the ink was quite dry on their agreement, turned to the question of their enemies, and they answered it in the oldest and most terrible of Roman ways, by writing names on lists. The proscriptions of the Second Triumvirate were not, in the cold arithmetic of history, the first time such lists had been drawn up. Sulla had done it a generation before, and the memory of that earlier darkness still lived in the bones of the city. But the knowledge that something terrible has happened before does not make its recurrence less terrible, and the lists that were posted in the forum, in the weeks after the meeting on the island, represented the deaths of hundreds of men, senators, knights, men of property and name, whose wealth would fund the wars to come, and whose removal would clear the field of opposition. It is said the three men haggled over the names with something approaching the detachment of merchants, trading one enemy for another, each surrendering someone from his own circle in exchange for the removal of someone who threatened him. Antony, it is said, gave up his own uncle. Octavian gave up Cicero, the great orator who had written and spoken against Antony with a ferocity that had given those speeches their collective name. The Philippics, fired like arrows at the man who now held the power to stop them, was caught on the road, attempting to reach the sea and sail away from what was coming. He was 63 years old, and had been at various moments of his long life the savior of the Republic, its most eloquent voice, its most anxious conscience. He was killed near his estate at Formiae, and it is said his hands were cut off and sent to Antony, who had them nailed above the speaker's platform in the Forum, the Rostra, where Cicero had stood so many times, and shaped the air of Rome with words. What Octavian thought of this, in the quiet of whatever room he occupied afterward, we cannot know. He left no record of his feelings in that moment. He was 20 years old, and had just consented to the death of the man who had, only months earlier, been his most powerful political patron, who had called him the young man sent by the gods, who had written to friends about him with a mixture of admiration and the particular condescension of the very old toward the very young, who are cleverer than expected. To give up Cicero was the price Antony demanded, and Octavian paid it. That is the only fact we have. What we may say with the gentle caution that history's distance allows is that the proscriptions marked something in him, not a breaking precisely, but a settling, the way stone settles after the earth has moved beneath it. He had entered this season of his life as a boy of 18, making an audacious claim, and he was moving through it, becoming something harder to name. Not yet the serene, marble-faced figure of later legend, but a man who had looked at the price tags attached to survival and chosen to pay them. The education was brutal, and the classroom was the whole shaking world, and the lesson, absorbed slowly through those months of mist and negotiation and terrible lists, was this: that power and goodness were not enemies, but neither were they simple companions, and that the distance between where he stood now and where he needed to go would require him to keep walking, even through the terrain that offered no comfortable ground. By the time the prescriptions had done their work, and the triumvirs had turned their combined attention eastward, toward Macedonia, toward the men who had killed Caesar, and who were even now gathering legions on the Aegean coast, the autumn had deepened into winter, and the fires of Rome burned longer each night in the shortening dark. The smoke rose from hearth and altar, and the flame of the oil lamps that burned in every window of the city, those small persistent lights that no wind had yet extinguished, moving gently in the draught of the long evening. Somewhere in that city, a young man who had given up much and gained more was turning his attention toward the east, toward the coming spring, toward the fields of Macedonia, where the last chapter of the old republic was waiting to be written. It was not a crossing he would make with ease, or with health, or with any of the outward signs of a conqueror, but he would make it. He always made it, and the fires kept burning through the winter night, steady and small, holding their warmth against the dark. The road east from Rome was long, and it wound through seasons, through rumor, through the slow, grinding preparation of armies being assembled and supplied and moved across the wide body of the world. And by the time the legions of the triumvirs had crossed the Adriatic and pushed through the soft green throat of Thrace, autumn was already beginning its work on the hills, touching the edges of the leaves with rust and gold, laying a cool gray mist across the low ground in the early mornings, so that the camps of both sides seemed to float, in those first pale hours before the sun climbed, like something not quite settled on the earth. It is the year 42 before the birth of Christ, and the young man we have been following, the one who has accepted a name, survived wolves, and bargained with harder men than himself, finds himself now in Macedonia, in the long, flat corridor of land near a place called Philippi, facing the armies of Marcus Brutus and Gaius Cassius, the last great champions of the Republic that Caesar had broken and that his murderers had hoped to restore. Breathe slowly now and let the scene come quietly. The plain near Philippi was broad and open, bounded to the north by the Pangaean mountains which sat heavy and dark against the sky, and to the south by marshes that breathed a constant damp exhalation into the air, so that the soldiers sleeping nearest them work with moisture on their faces, and the torches set along the camp perimeters guttered and spat in ways that torches on dry ground did not. The Via Egnatia ran straight through it all like a spine, the great Roman road that connected the Adriatic coast to the east, worn smooth by the sandals and boots of countless legions across the generations. And it was along this road and across the fields on either side of it that two enormous forces had come to rest, watching one another, measuring one another, waiting. Octavian was 21 years old. He had been ill before the crossing, and the story goes that he had been gravely ill, so ill that there were those around him who believed he would not survive to fight at all, and yet he had come. Whatever one thinks of the young man who would later become Augustus, it is worth holding that image for a moment, the pale, slight figure, making the crossing not out of easy confidence, but out of the particular, exhausted stubbornness of someone who understands that to stay behind is to cease to matter, and to cease to matter is to die as surely as any battlefield might arrange. His colleague Mark Antony was the soldier in this campaign. It is honest to say that plainly, and the ancient sources themselves are honest enough to say so too. Antony was older, broader, shaped by years of actual soldiering. And it was Antony who directed the movements of their combined forces with the authority of a man who had learned war in the field beside Julius Caesar himself. The deployments, the timing, the tactical decisions, these belonged largely to Antony, and whatever happened in the days ahead would carry his stamp more than Octavian's. And yet Octavian was there. That too mattered. The first battle came on the 3rd day of October, it is said, though accounts differ, and in the gray morning mist that rose from the marshes and blurred the distances, the two sides engaged with the particular chaos and terrible noise that only those who have stood in such moments can truly understand. Antony pressed hard against the forces of Cassius on the southern wing, driving forward with great force and breaking through toward the enemy camp. On the other side of the line, however, Brutus attacked Octavian's wing, and here the story grows careful and quiet, because the ancient accounts tell us that Octavian was not at his post when the attack came, that he had withdrawn, or been moved, or been sheltered elsewhere on account of his illness, or the warnings of a trusted advisor who had dreamed some dark dream of danger. The story goes that his litter was found afterward pierced by enemy javelins, and that had he been inside it, he would not have survived. Whatever the truth of that moment, his legions held without him, or broke and then steadied, and the first day ended without a clear conclusion for either side. Cassius, who did not know that Antony had struck a decisive blow on the far wing, believed the battle lost entirely, and in the deepening dusk, in the confusion that comes when you cannot see far enough to know what has actually happened, he chose to end his life rather than face capture. He was one of the men who had held the knife in the theater of Pompey, and now he was gone, and the mist from the low ground settled over the camp like a cloth drawn over a lamp. The armies rested. 3 weeks passed in that flat plain, 3 weeks of careful watching and supply line worry, because the triumvir's forces were sustained by sea, and the sea was not entirely safe, and hunger is its own kind of battle that does not announce itself with trumpets. The mountains sat in their silence to the north, the marshes breezed, the morning mists came and went, and the torchlight in the camps burned through the long nights in that particular way of torchlight in open country, wavering slightly with the movement of the air, making shadows that reached and withdrew and reached again. Octavian in these 3 weeks was present. He attended councils. He was seen. Whatever he could not provide in military genius, he provided in what might be called the symbolism of endurance. He was the name, he was the blood, he was the reason that the soldiers believed they were avenging Caesar, and that reason needed a body attached to it, a face that could be looked upon and recognized. He understood this about himself with the clarity that would come to define his long reign, that what he was in these early years was often more important than what he did. The second battle came in the third week, pressed partly by Brutus's logistical situation and partly by the restlessness of his own troops, who had perhaps been waiting long enough and were beginning to feel the weight of continued waiting more than the fear of fighting. This time the engagement was broader and more complete, and this time Antony and Octavian's forces together broke the lines that Brutus had arranged, pushing through and around them in a movement that became, as the afternoon wore on, less a battle than a dissolution, an army losing its coherence, losing its belief in what it was doing, coming apart the way that things come apart when the idea holding them together is no longer persuasive enough to hold. Brutus escaped the field. He moved into the hills with what remained of a personal escort, and there, as evening came and the stars began their slow appearance in the sky above Macedonia, he too chose to end his life rather than submit to capture. He was the other man with the knife. He was gone now too, and with him went the last organized military hope of a restored republic, not because republics were wrong or bad, but because this particular moment in the long story of Rome had decided with the blunt practicality of armies and exhaustion and hunger that it would go a different way. Octavian walked the field that night, or so the story goes. What he thought, standing there in the autumn dark with the torches burning low and the plain still carrying the marks of everything that had just passed through it, we cannot know with any honesty. He was 21 years old. He had survived 2 battles, however his survival is to be understood or qualified. He had watched the Republic's defenders remove themselves from the world, and the world had become, in a single autumn, enormously more open in front of him. The torchlight would have moved in the night wind, the way it always does on open ground, casting its warm and temporary gold across the faces of the living and the shapes of the field, and then withdrawing into itself and reaching again. He was tired. He was ill. He was the heir of Caesar and the partner of Antony, and there was so much still ahead of him that he could not have seen even the outline of it from where he stood. But he was there, and being there, as he already knew, was itself a kind of power. Let that thought rest now, softly, without weight. In the chapter that waits ahead, we will step away from the fields and the noise of armies, and move instead into the interior life of a Roman household, into Lamplight, and the small domestic rituals of a world trying to find its ordinary rhythms again. And that quiet will be waiting for you whenever you are ready to continue. For now, let the mist come in from the low ground. Let the torches find their stillness. Let the plain of Philippi grow distant and dim. The oil lamp has been burning for a little while now, its small flame steady in the stillness, and it is a good moment to let the wider world grow quiet and to step very gently through the door of a Roman house at the edge of the Augustan age, to let its rhythms wash over you like warm water, to breathe its air, to sit for a time in its particular quality of light. The house begins before you enter it. There is a threshold of worn travertine, smooth from a generation of footfalls, and on either side of the narrow doorway, the plaster is painted in deep ochre and soft terracotta, colors that have faded just enough to feel ancient, even to the people who live within. A small bronze knocker, shaped perhaps like a lion's head or the open palm of a hand, catches what little remains of the afternoon sun. And then the door opens, and the house receives you. The first thing you notice is the smell. It is not unpleasant. It is ancient and layered, a mixture of beeswax and lamp oil, and the faint sweetness of dried herbs hung somewhere near the kitchen. And beneath all of that, a deeper smell, something mineral and cool, which is the smell of stone and plaster, that has never quite dried in all its years of standing. Roman houses breathe slowly. They hold the morning coolness well into the afternoon, and at night they give back a warmth that seems to come from the walls themselves, as though the stone remembers every fire that has ever burned within it. You pass through the entryway, the fauces, which is a narrow corridor barely wide enough for 2 people to walk abreast, and then the house opens before you into the atrium, and something in the chest releases, because the atrium is generous and calm and full of a particular quality of light that you cannot quite find anywhere else. There is an opening in the ceiling, the compluvium, a rectangular eye turned up toward the sky, and through it the light falls in a slow diagonal, shifting with the hour, catching the surface of the impluvium below, a shallow rectangular pool sunk into the floor at the center of the room, its water absolutely still and dark, holding in its depths a perfect inverted replica of the sky above. The light on that water trembles only very slightly, as though the house itself is breathing. All around the atrium, the household arranges itself quietly. There is a chest of dark wood bound with iron along one wall, the family's records perhaps kept within it, or the household accounts written on wax tablets in a neat and patient hand. Along another wall there are small alcoves where masks of wax, made in the likenesses of ancestors long since departed, regard the room with a kind of serene blankness. These are the imagines, the portraits of the lineage, and a family of any standing would be proud to have many of them. They are simply present, the way all long ago things are present in a house that has been loved and lived in for many years. But the heart of the house is not the atrium. The heart of the house is the Lararium, the small household shrine that stands usually in a corner of the kitchen or against a wall of the garden, though in a grander home it might have its own dedicated niche in the atrium itself, painted bright with pigments of red and yellow and green. The Lararium is a tiny temple in miniature, and within it, or painted upon its back wall, stand the Lares, the guardian spirits of the household, depicted usually as dancing young men in short tunics, each raising a drinking horn and a shallow offering dish, their expressions perpetually cheerful and a little solemn all at once. Between them, in many Lararia, stands the genius of the paterfamilias, the animating spirit of the head of the household, shown as a togaed figure, with a fold of cloth drawn over his head in the gesture of prayer. Every morning, without great ceremony, but with great constancy, the household gathers here. The paterfamilias, or a slave appointed to the task, places a small offering before the shrine, a garland of fresh flowers if the season permits, a few grains of salt and spelt, a honey cake, a small cup of wine that catches the lamplight and holds it in a glowing amber stillness. A brief prayer is spoken, the same words or nearly the same words that were spoken the morning before and will be spoken the morning after, because constancy is the whole point, because the gods of the household require not grand gestures, but simple faithfulness, day after day, across a lifetime. The lamp before the Lararium is kept burning. Its smoke rises thin and straight in the still air of the early morning, and when it curls and wavers, it is taken sometimes as a sign of something, though of what exactly is a matter of gentle household debate. The morning moves through the house by its own slow logic. In the kitchen, which is small and surprisingly dark, the fire is already burning on its raised hearth, and over it a pot of something, emmer porridge perhaps, or a soup of lentils with cumin and oil, sends up a slow steam that drifts toward the low ceiling and makes the whole room close and warm and deeply comfortable. The kitchen smells of garlic and old smoke, and the particular sweetness of olive oil heated in a clay pan, and the slaves who work here move with the efficient, unhurried ease of people who know exactly what they are doing and have been doing it since before the household was fully awake. Water is everywhere in a Roman house that can afford it. There is a fountain, perhaps, in the garden at the back, the peristyle garden, planted with clipped box hedges and rosemary and bay, where a narrow channel of water runs along the walkway, and the sound it makes is so quiet and continuous that after a little while you stop hearing it as a sound at all and begin to feel it simply as part of the texture of the air. In wealthier homes there are pipes of lead running within the walls, carrying water from the aqueducts, and the faint sound of moving water is a constant, subterranean presence in the house, like a pulse. The tablinum, the master's study, opens off the atrium, and from it the paterfamilias conducts his morning salutatio, receiving the clients who come each day in the cool early hours to pay their respects, and to ask sometimes for favors or assistance, or simply to be seen associating with a man of standing. This ritual is entirely formal and entirely personal, all at once. The client bows, the patron greets him by name, and in this exchange of recognition, something ancient is renewed, a web of obligation and loyalty and affection that holds Roman society together as surely as any law. By midday, the house has grown quieter. The light in the atrium has shifted, the diagonal beam gone vertical and then past vertical, the water of the impluvium holding a different sky now, a sky of high afternoon. People rest. The city outside quiets. Even the street sounds, The creak of cartwheels, the calls of vendors, the distant clang of a coppersmith soften and slow, as though the whole of Rome is drawing one long collective breath. In the early evening the lamps are lit, one by one, and this is the moment the house seems most fully itself. The oil lamps, small and terracotta, sit in their brackets along the walls and on their stands in the corners of rooms, and the light they give is amber and unsteady and very beautiful, casting long soft shadows that move with the movement of the air, so that the room seems always in gentle motion, even when everything is perfectly still. Dinner, the cena, is laid in the triclinium, the dining room, where 3 couches are arranged around the low table, and the family reclines in the Roman way, leaning on the left elbow, reaching with the right hand toward the dishes of olives and bread and whatever the kitchen has produced. Conversation is easy and slow. A little wine, mixed with water, is poured. Outside, the city goes about its evening business, and then gradually the lamps are extinguished one by one, and the house settles into darkness and warmth and the long unconscious life of sleep. Only the lamp before the Lararium continues to burn, tended perhaps once more in the night by a devoted hand, its flame a small, persistent beacon for the guardian spirits of the threshold, keeping watch in the dark over everyone within. Rest here a little while, in this warm and lamplit space. Tomorrow the wider world reasserts itself, with all its complicated demands and uncertain figures, and there are more stories still to follow, stories of wars not yet finished, of rivals not yet quieted, of a man still in the slow and difficult work of making a fractured world hold still. But that can wait. The impluvium holds its mirror of still water. The lares dance in silence on their painted wall. The flame burns low and steady, and the house breathes and breathes and breathes. The smell of wood smoke drifts in from somewhere beyond the hills, the kind of smoke that belongs to cooking fires and braziers, and the small, patient warmth of a household settling into evening. And it is into that particular quality of late afternoon stillness that we find ourselves returning now to a Rome that had not yet found its stillness, to a world still restless and unsatisfied, even after the great thunder of Philippi had rolled away across the Macedonian plain and faded into memory, because the death of Brutus and Cassius did not end the fighting. History is rarely so tidy, so willing to close one door and leave another firmly shut. The Roman world in those years after Philippi resembled nothing so much as a house in which many fires have been set simultaneously. And the man who would one day be Augustus found himself moving from room to smoldering room, trying to keep the whole structure from collapse, always aware that the floor beneath him might give way at any moment, always careful to place each foot with something approaching perfect deliberateness. The western provinces, the Italian heartland, the seas, all of these remained contested, uncertain, alive with the particular dangerous energy of men and women who had not yet accepted the new order of things, who were not entirely sure there was a new order of things, who were watching and waiting, and sometimes acting with sharp and sudden violence. And among the figures moving through that uneasy world, 2 stand out in the years just after Philippi with particular vividness: a woman of remarkable and formidable will, and a man who commanded the sea. Fulvia was the wife of Mark Antony, and it would be a great mistake, the kind of mistake that ancient sources sometimes invite, and that we need not follow, to imagine her as a merely ornamental presence, a woman defined entirely by the men whose names surrounded hers. The ancient writers who described her were often hostile, often condescending in the particular way that powerful women tended to attract hostility and condescension in the Roman world. And yet even through the distortion of that hostility, something real and formidable comes through. She was, by all accounts, a woman who understood power as a practical thing, a tool to be used with precision, and who had watched the Roman world closely enough to know that the arrangements made at Philippi and after were not permanent, were not stable, and that Octavian in particular was a young man whose growing influence in Italy represented a direct threat to her husband's position and her own. The immediate source of tension was, in its origins, something almost ordinary: land. Octavian had promised land to the veterans of Philippi, tens of thousands of soldiers who had marched and fought and survived and who now expected their reward in the form of farms, plots of Italian earth where they might settle and live out what remained of their years in relative peace. This was an ancient and not unreasonable expectation, deeply embedded in the Roman understanding of what a general owed his legions. The difficulty was that the land had to come from somewhere, which meant it had to be taken from somewhere, which meant that farmers and smallholders in the most fertile regions of northern Italy found themselves displaced, their fields measured out and reassigned, their households disrupted, their futures suddenly uncertain. The resentment this caused was sharp and immediate, and entirely understandable. Fulvia saw in this resentment an opportunity, and together with Lucius Antonius, who was both Antony's brother and, as it happened, that year's consul, a coincidence of offices that gave the whole affair a complicated political texture, she moved to channel the anger of the displaced and the discontented into something resembling an armed resistance against Octavian's authority. It is said that she was the more energetic of the two in pushing matters toward open confrontation, though the ancient sources say a great many things about Fulvia that we should hold gently, with some awareness of the interests of those doing the telling. What seems clear enough is that through the winter months of what we would call 41 years before the Common Era, the situation in central Italy deteriorated from political argument into something that had the texture, if not always the full scale, of civil war. Lucius and his forces eventually withdrew to the ancient Etruscan city of Perugia, a place that sat on its hill above the Tiber Valley with the old, settled assurance of a town that had seen very much come and go across many centuries, and Octavian's forces surrounded it. What followed was a siege, long and grinding and cold, the kind of winter campaign that no soldier loves, a slow tightening of the encirclement that cut off supplies and reduced the defenders by degrees to hunger and exhaustion rather than dramatic assault. The smoke from the city's fires would have been visible across the valley in those months, rising thin and pale against the winter sky, a signal of diminishing warmth, diminishing resources, diminishing hope. When Perugia fell, in the early months of the following year, Octavian's response was, by the standards of Roman civil conflict, relatively restrained, though the city itself suffered badly, largely through fire, and the story goes that the members of the local senate were executed, though the numbers and the details of this are uncertain and contested even in the ancient sources. Lucius Antonius survived and was eventually sent to govern a distant province, which was a practical and faith-saving resolution to an awkward problem. Fulvia herself had not been in Perugia, had been moving through Italy and then Greece as events shifted, and she died not long after, in the Greek city of Sicyon, before any direct confrontation with Octavian could be resolved. Her death came at what we might call a convenient moment for everyone involved, though we should not press that observation too hard. The Perusian War, as history has called it, was in some ways a minor affair when measured against the great battles that bookended it, and yet it mattered enormously to Octavian's consolidation of Italy. Patient work of making himself the undisputed authority in the western half of the Roman world. Each crisis navigated, each threat absorbed or dissolved or outlasted, added a layer of solidity to his position, the way successive seasons of frost and thaw gradually compress the earth until it becomes something truly firm underfoot. And then there was the sea. Sextus Pompey was the surviving son of Pompey the Great, and he had inherited his father's name, something of his father's following, and a very considerable talent for naval warfare. He had established himself in Sicily with a fleet that the ancient sources describe as formidable and well-handled, and from that island position, he was able to disrupt the grain supply routes that fed Rome, an enormously powerful form of leverage in a city that depended on imported grain for its very sustenance. The people of Rome knew hunger during these years in ways that were direct and immediate and frightening, and they blamed, naturally enough, those who were supposed to be in charge of things. Octavian's early attempts to deal with Sextus by force were not uniformly successful. The sea was not his element in the way that the land and the political chamber were, and Sextus had years of experience commanding ships in exactly these waters. There were engagements that went badly, storms that scattered fleets before they could even reach their objectives, a frustrating series of setbacks that must have tested the patience even of a man as constitutionally patient as Octavian was learning to be. It is in these years that one catches glimpses of the long, slow education of a ruler. The understanding that power is not simply seized, but maintained. That every day of maintenance is its own kind of victory. That the man who endures when others falter inherits the field without needing to storm it. The full resolution of the Sextus problem would come later, would require the remarkable skills of a general named Agrippa, would require the building of new harbors, and the training of new crews, and the development of new tactics. But all of that was still gathering itself in the future, still being prepared in the patient, methodical way that Octavian preferred. For now, the young man who would be Augustus was learning the texture of power in its most unglamorous form, the daily negotiation with circumstances that refused to cooperate, the management of allies whose interests only partially aligned with his own, the slow and sometimes painful realization that ruling the world was less like a triumph and more like tending a fire through a long and uncertain night, feeding it carefully, watching the direction of the wind, making sure the warmth endured. He was learning, too, in these years, something about the people around him, who could be trusted, who had depths of loyalty that went beyond self-interest, who was merely watching for an opportunity. And somewhere in the careful inventory of the world he was building, he was also attending to his own household, his own life, the question of who would stand beside him in all of it. That question was about to find its answer in someone quite extraordinary, someone whose quiet steadiness would become, across the following decades, as constant and as necessary as the warmth of a lamp kept burning through the long watches of the night. She came into his life in the middle of winter, and Rome was cold that year in the way that the city sometimes became cold, not violently, not with great drama, but with a slow, settling chill that crept beneath cloaks and gathered in the corners of rooms, turning the breath of the forum into soft, pale clouds, and leaving frost along the lip of every fountain by morning. It was the kind of cold that made people draw closer to their fires, that made the lamplight in a house seem warmer and more necessary than ever. And it is perhaps fitting that it was in this season of drawing inward, of seeking warmth and stillness, that Octavian first came to know the woman who would become the fixed and quiet center of his life for the next 5 decades and more. Her name was Livia Drusilla, and she was, by every account that has come down to us, a woman of exceptional composure. She was not yet 20 years old when Octavian encountered her, and yet those who wrote about her, then and afterward, consistently reached for words that suggested something older than youth, words like gravity and steadiness, and a certain deliberate calm that was not coldness but rather a kind of interior warmth that did not spill or scatter. She moved through rooms the way good lamplight moves, without hurry, touching everything gently, making the space around her feel more settled than it had been before she arrived. The circumstances of their meeting were, by the standards of modern sensibility, rather complicated. Livia was already married when Octavian came to know her, wed to a man named Tiberius Claudius Nero, a senator of old and distinguished family, and she was carrying that man's second child when the relationship with Octavian began to deepen into something neither of them seemed able or willing to set aside. What her inner life was in those months, whether she felt the pull of the situation as conflict or as clarity or as something altogether more complex, the historical record does not tell us with any certainty. What we know is the surface of events, that within a remarkably brief period of time, her first husband released her from the marriage in what was apparently an amicable, or at least a formal and dignified arrangement, that the child she was carrying, a son who would be named Drusus, was born shortly before the wedding, and that Octavian and Livia were married early in the year that historians have placed 38 years before the birth of Christ, with her first husband Tiberius Claudius Nero himself reportedly present at the celebration and giving the bride away, as convention required of a father figure. It is said that this last detail caused some amusement in Rome, and that a verse or two of satirical poetry circulated in the weeks that followed, for Romans enjoyed nothing quite so much as finding the human awkwardness beneath the dignified surface of public life. But the awkwardness, if it existed, did not last. What lasted was the marriage itself, and that is the remarkable thing, the thing that stands out against the texture of the age, like a single steady flame in a room full of guttering candles. Octavian, who would become Augustus, who would hold the Roman world in his careful hands, for more than 40 years, was a man who seems to have had a restless and sometimes undisciplined private life in other respects. The ancient sources suggest various infidelities across the decades, and his relationships with his daughter and other family members could be difficult, even anguished. But Livia remained. She remained not as a passive figure, not as a decorative presence, but as something that those who observed them closely seemed to understand was genuinely sustaining. He consulted her. He wrote things down to read to her, and read her responses carefully afterward. He is said to have prepared notes before difficult conversations with her, wanting to be precise, wanting to be heard and to hear in return. There is something in that image, the most powerful man in the world, writing careful notes before speaking to his wife, that speaks more warmly of both of them than a dozen grander gestures might. Livia's intelligence was, by all accounts, practical rather than ornamental. She did not write poetry, or at least none has survived. She did not, so far as we know, make a point of surrounding herself with philosophers or debating the finer points of Stoic doctrine in fashionable gatherings. What she appears to have done, quietly and consistently across decades, was to understand people, to observe them with patience, to learn what moved them and what frightened them and what they needed to hear, and to use that understanding with a discretion that left almost no fingerprints on the historical record. We see the effects of her presence more than the presence itself. We hear occasionally of her interceding for someone who had fallen from favor, of a word spoken at the right moment in a private hour, of a sentence or two that redirected a decision that might otherwise have gone badly. She seems to have operated not by assertion but by timing, by knowing when a word planted gently would take root, and letting the seasons do the rest. She was also, it should be said, a woman of her time and of her class, and those who wish to see her only as a wise and benevolent influence are perhaps not reading the full texture of what survives. Later writers, some of them centuries removed from the events and not uniformly to be trusted, made her a figure of considerable shadow, accusing her of manipulations that extended to the darkest corners of dynastic ambition, of smoothing the path for her own son Tiberius by means that they described in terms that amounted to poison and calculation. Most modern historians treat these accusations with considerable skepticism, noting that the sources that make them are late, hostile, and inclined toward the dramatic, and that the portrait of a scheming matriarch tells us as much about Roman anxieties concerning powerful women as it does about Livia herself. What seems more solidly rooted in the evidence is that she was indeed ambitious for Tiberius, as any mother in her position might have been, and that she navigated the painful and complicated question of Augustan succession with more patience and persistence than the situation perhaps deserved. Whether that ambition crossed any lines that even the flexible ethics of the age would have recognized is something we cannot know with confidence, and it is perhaps enough to hold the question gently and let it rest. What is easier to hold, and what settles more quietly into the imagination, is the texture of the life they shared across so many years. The long evenings in the house on the Palatine Hill, which was by Roman standards a modest dwelling, despite belonging to the master of the world, its rooms painted in soft ochres and blues, its floors warmed where the household fires could reach them, its small shrine with its household gods receiving the quiet morning observances that structured a Roman day. Livia moved through all of this with the same composure she brought to the larger world, managing the household, which in practice meant managing a small organization of slaves and freedmen and secretaries and visitors and petitioners, receiving women of quality who came to pay their respects or seek her influence, spinning wool as tradition demanded, though she was not obligated to do so, keeping alive in her person the image of the old Roman matron, even as everything around her was changing in ways that had no precedent. She outlived him in the end. Augustus died in his 69th year, having been unwell for a long season, and Livia was beside him. It is said she was there at the last, that the final words he spoke were to her, words that have been reported in more than one form and that we cannot verify, but that every version of them carries a quality of tenderness. She went on after his death to live another 15 years, honored and sometimes frustrated by the reign of her son Tiberius, who had complicated feelings toward her that the sources describe with characteristic Roman indirection. She received divine honors after her own death, eventually, consecrated as a goddess in the manner the age reserved for those who had moved close enough to power that the boundary between the human and the sacred began to seem negotiable. But all of that belongs to a later hour, and tonight it is enough to rest in the earlier image, the winter of their meeting, the cold pressing gently against the walls of a Roman house, the lamps burning with that steady, unspectacular warmth that makes a room feel like a world in itself. Two people, both still young, already shaped by more turbulence than most lives contain, finding in each other something that would prove, against all reasonable expectation, to be enduring. The flame between them steadied, and it did not go out. And even now, in the soft drift towards sleep, it is possible to imagine the house on the Palatine settling into the night, the oil lamps dimming one by one, the city outside quieting by degrees, the long partnership of that life beginning its long, slow burn through all the years ahead. Other distances were growing too, in that same season, between Octavian and the man who had once been his partner in power, a growing space that no single lamp could quite illuminate. But that is a story for another night, and for now, everything is still. The lamps were burning low across the city tonight, as they always did in the deep hours before dawn, their small flames bending and steadying in the drafts that moved through open courtyards and beneath half-closed shutters, as though even fire understood the rhythm of rest and wakefulness, of holding on and letting go. And it is in that spirit, of something held and then slowly, almost imperceptibly released, that we return now to the story of Octavian and the man who had stood beside him, or rather opposite him, across the vast and complicated table of the Roman world, Marcus Antonius, Mark Antony, soldier, orator, the kind of man whose presence filled a room the way a torch fills a cellar, sudden, warm, almost overwhelming. And for a time, perhaps 10 years, perhaps a little more, these two men had shared the weight of Rome between them, each gripping his end of something enormous, each watching the other across the distance that separated east from west. And slowly, with the particular sadness of things that drift rather than break, coming to understand that the distance was only growing. It had not always felt like drifting. In the early years of the triumvirate, after Philippi, after the long campaigns in Macedonia, there had been a kind of rough equilibrium, the way two stones dropped into still water send out rings that meet and cross and settle without destroying one another. Antony had taken the east, that ancient, perfumed half of the world, with its Greek cities and its grain-rich river valleys, its accumulated centuries of culture and wealth. Octavian had taken the west, the harder portion in some ways, the portion that required rebuilding, resettling, arguing with land-hungry veterans, and managing the slow, exhausting work of making a fractured Italy whole again. It is said that neither man envied the other exactly, though each watched the other's territory with the quiet attention of someone who has not yet decided whether what he sees is a rival or a reflection. The marriage had been meant to help. Antony had taken Octavian's sister, as his wife, and it is worth pausing for a moment on that arrangement, not because it failed, though it did, but because it succeeded for longer than the histories sometimes remember. Octavia was by all accounts a woman of remarkable grace and steadiness, a woman who understood the diplomatic weight she carried, and carried it with what can only be described as a kind of luminous patience. She traveled with Antony, managed his correspondence in his absences, interceded between him and her brother when the language between the two men grew sharp. For a few years, her presence in the marriage was like lamplight in a cold corridor, genuinely warming, genuinely useful, softening the drafts from either end. But Antony was a man of the East. It is said that the East changes those who spend long enough within it, that the scale of its old kingdoms, the warmth of its air, the extraordinary luxury available to those at its summit, rearranges something in a Roman sensibility. Whether or not that is simply a story Romans told themselves to explain what happened next is difficult to ignore. Antony moved closer and closer into the orbit of Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt, ruler of the last great Hellenistic kingdom, a woman of considerable intelligence and political calculation, though the story has always preferred to remember her in other terms. The bond between them was not new. It had begun, the story goes, years before Octavia entered the picture. But after Antony returned to the East, it deepened into something that was no longer merely useful, no longer merely strategic, but genuinely complex, genuinely mutual, and from Octavian's perspective, genuinely dangerous. What Octavian understood, perhaps more clearly than anyone else in the Roman world, was that the East was not simply a territory. It was a way of seeing power. And Antony, spending his winters in Alexandria, allowing himself to be celebrated in the language of Greek kingship, permitting his image to be woven together with Dionysus, with Osiris, with the divine vocabulary of a world that had never shared Rome's uneasy relationship with monarchy. Antony was not simply enjoying himself. He was, whether consciously or not, becoming something that Rome could be taught to fear. And Octavian was nothing if not a man who understood what could be taught. The propaganda moved in both directions, as it always does between men who have decided that words are safer than swords, at least for a while. Antony sent letters to Rome accusing Octavian of illegitimacy, of cruelty, of failing to honor agreements made at this summit or that negotiation. Octavian, more carefully, more patiently, allowed stories to circulate about the luxury of Alexandria, about Antony's Eastern dress, his Eastern customs, his gifts of Roman territory to Cleopatra's children. None of these stories needed to be entirely true to do their work. They needed only to feel true to a Roman audience, to an Italian farmer or a senator sitting in the evening shade of his portico. And to that audience, a Roman general dressing in the robes of a foreign god, acknowledging children born of a foreign queen, was something that itched against every instinct they possessed. The marriage to Octavia ended, or rather Antony let it lapse, formally repudiating her, which was in Roman terms not merely a personal matter but a public one, an insult to her brother, a signal about what and whom Antony had chosen. Octavia, by all accounts, bore this with the same quiet dignity that had characterized everything she did, returning to Rome without seam, continuing to care for the children she had with Antony, continuing to be almost pointedly gracious. She was, in her restraint, more damaging to Antony's reputation in Rome than any speech her brother might have made, because Octavian did not need to make speeches, or rather he made them through other people, through the slow accumulation of incident and implication, through the careful management of what Romans saw and heard and felt about the man in Alexandria. There is something almost melancholy in watching how this estrangement worked. Two men who had once divided the world by negotiation, who had eaten together at Brundisium and made agreements at Tarentum and clasped hands across the geography of a shared ambition, drifting, not in anger exactly, but in the particular cold silence of men who have understood that there is not enough world for both of them, and have begun the slow work of not saying so. The lamplight in Roman houses bent and wavered through all of this, indifferent to the scale of what was moving between east and west, the tide pulling in its long, inevitable direction. In the winter houses of the wealthy, lamps burned through the night on iron stands beside doorways, illuminating the painted walls, the small figures of the household gods in their Lararium niches, the quiet faces of sleeping children who would grow up in whatever world these two men finally made or unmade between them. What is perhaps most worth carrying with you into sleep is not the drama of it all, the accusations, the letters, the repudiation, but the texture of how slowly it happened. A decade or more of gradual separation, 1,000 small decisions that each looked like almost nothing on their own, but accumulated the way silt accumulates in a river mouth, quietly, invisibly, until one day the channel has changed and the water finds it has only one way left to go. Antony choosing to stay another season in Alexandria, Octavian choosing to say nothing about it this time, and then next time, and then the time after, Octavia sailing out to meet her husband and being turned back before she arrived, and the whole of Rome drawing its breath and noting what that meant. These are not moments of high drama. They are moments of weather, of tide, of the ordinary, heartbreaking way that shared things come undone when neither party quite reaches across to hold them together. And so, as the lamps burn low in the houses of the Augustan world, and as the Tiber moves through the city in the dark below the great bridges, carrying with it whatever the day has left upon its surface, the ash of burned things, the petals of flowers from upstream, the ordinary light of stars caught and released in passing, let that image stay with you. Two torches on opposite ends of the world, each burning in its own wind, each casting light only so far before the dark begins again between them. What comes next is already moving on the water, patient and quiet and still some chapters away. Sleep now, let the river carry it. The sea off the Ambracian Gulf in the early days of September in the year 31 before the birth of Christ was the color of old pewter in the morning light, the kind of gray that holds within it the memory of every storm that has ever passed across it, and the promise of a stillness that will come once the wind decides, at last, to choose a direction and hold it there. The water moved in long, low swells, almost imperceptible from a distance, as though the gulf itself were breathing slowly in its sleep, and above it the sky was pale and uncommitted, the sun not yet strong enough to burn away the haze that had settled over the headlands during the night, clinging to the rocky shores of Epirus like a gauze that the world had drawn around itself for reasons it could not quite explain. It is worth pausing here, before anything moves, before any oar is raised or sail unfurled, to simply rest in the texture of that morning, and understand that what would happen in those waters was not in the living of it the great decisive thunderclap that later ages would make of it. It was a long, slow, exhausting day that began with waiting and ended with absence, and the man who stood on the promontory and watched it all unfold was not a man swept up in the glory of his own legend. He was 32 years old. He had been ill more than once during this campaign, and he had spent months watching disease and desertion thin the forces of his enemy with a patience that was itself a kind of strategy, a willingness to let time do the work that swords could not accomplish as cleanly. Marcus Antonius and Cleopatra had been encamped at Actium through the summer, their fleet resting within the shelter of the Gulf, their army on the shore, and the weeks had not been kind to either. It is said that illness moved through the camp like a slow tide, that the heat was punishing, that morale among the soldiers and sailors had been seeping away with the quiet persistence of water through cracked stone. Deserters had been crossing to Octavian's lines with some regularity, and among them were men of consequence, commanders and counselors who had read the signs and made their calculations and concluded that the future lay elsewhere. Each departure was a small wound, and wounds, accumulated across a long summer, have a way of changing what a man believes is still possible. When Antony's fleet emerged from the Gulf on that September morning, moving out into the open water, it did so in a way that even then must have carried within it the sense of an ending rather than a beginning. The great warships were heavy, many-oared, built for strength rather than speed, and they moved through those pewter swells with a slow, deliberate dignity that was almost elegiac. Octavian's fleet, commanded by his incomparable Admiral Marcus Agrippa, was lighter, faster, more nimble, and had spent weeks positioning itself with careful, unhurried expertise. Agrippa had a gift for naval warfare that was as natural and unforced as breathing, and the months of preparation had given him every advantage that patience and intelligence could supply. The battle itself, when it came, was less a single catastrophic collision than a long, grinding series of engagements spread across the face of that gray water, ships maneuvering, oars working, the smell of salt and sweat and pine-pitched timber hanging over everything. What seems to have shifted the day irrevocably was the moment when Cleopatra's squadron, which had held behind the main line, suddenly raised its sails and turned south through a gap in the fighting, making for the open sea and the long voyage back to Egypt. Whether this was a planned retreat, a flight born of panic, or some agreed stratagem between her and Antony that has never been satisfactorily untangled. The story goes that Antony, watching her sails diminish in the haze, took a small boat and followed her, transferring from his flagship and leaving his fleet behind him on the water. It is that image, more than any clash of oars or the smoke of burning ships, that carries the true weight of what Actium meant. A man leaving, a turning away from one world toward another, toward the woman he loved, toward Egypt and its warmth and its dreaming antiquity, toward something that must have felt in that moment more real and more worth having than any further contest for a world that had perhaps already slipped beyond his grasp. His fleet, without him, fought on for a time, and then, as fleets do when the spirit has gone out of a thing, it ceased to fight, surrendering to Agrippa's ships in the cooling afternoon as the haze began to thin at last and the sunlight came through in long, pale shafts across the water. Octavian watched all of this from the shore and from his own position in the fighting, and what he felt in those hours is something no source records with any confidence, and so it is perhaps wisest to imagine him simply watchful, contained, absorbing the information that came to him and processing it with the same quiet, internal steadiness that had carried him from the moment he read Caesar's will in Apollonia at the age of 18. He had never been a man who wore his interior life on the surface of his face. What the day gave him was enormous, and he would have known it, but there was no celebration recorded, no great shout of exultation into that salt-smelling air. There was only the work of what came next. What came next was a year that would reshape the known world with the same inexorable patience that water reshapes a riverbed, and Octavian pursued it across the sea to Egypt with a thoroughness that left nothing unresolved. Antony, by the time Octavian reached Alexandria in the summer of the following year, had already died, the story going that he fell upon his own sword in the belief that Cleopatra was already gone. A last act of a Roman general in the old tradition of the thing, and Cleopatra herself, held in Octavian's power and understanding with perfect clarity what her future held in the event of her captivity being prolonged, died not long after him, by means that have been discussed and debated across 2,000 years without final resolution, though the image of the serpent is the one that time has preferred, whether or not it is precisely true. And then there was only Octavian, standing alone at the summit, in a way that no Roman had stood before him and survived. Caesar had stood there and been killed for it. Pompey had reached for it and been destroyed. Crassus had died in the eastern sands. The men who had shared the triumvirate with Octavian were gone, one dead, one removed and exiled, and the last serious rival for the Roman world had followed his beloved queen into whatever quiet lay beyond the reach of politics. The world was his, and he was 32 years old, and he had been ill, and he was tired in the particular way that a person becomes tired when they have been holding themselves very carefully together across a very long, very dangerous decade, and can at last, with great caution, begin to consider letting the tension go. He would not return to Rome immediately. There were things to settle in Egypt, arrangements to be made, the vast wealth of the Ptolemaic treasury to be absorbed into Roman accounting, the province to be constituted in a way that kept its extraordinary resources under his personal supervision rather than the Senate's. He walked through Alexandria, the story goes, and looked at the body of Alexander the great conqueror, preserved these many centuries in its crystal tomb, and paid it the respect of a man who understood what it meant to have come this far. He did not, it is said, wish to see the tombs of the Ptolemies when they were offered to him, saying that he had come to see a king, not corpses, which is the kind of remark that a man makes when he is beginning, perhaps for the first time, to understand the difference between the reaching and the having, between the long dark voyage toward power and the strange still morning when the voyage ends and the real work, the patient and unending work, stands waiting on the shore before him. The sea at Actium would have been quiet again by nightfall on that September day, the swells moving through the darkness in their slow ancient rhythm, indifferent to what had passed across them, carrying neither victory nor defeat in their long gray pewter undulations, only the sound of water against the hulls of ships that were already being stilled, and the smell of salt, and somewhere far to the south, the beginning of a wind that would carry a man home, home to the city that had been waiting all this time for someone patient and careful enough to hold it gently, without breaking it, and to make of it something that might, with long tending, begin to resemble peace. What that peace would look like, what it would cost, and how a man who had spent his entire adult life in war would learn to govern in stillness. That is a story for the next quiet hour, when you are ready to let your eyes close and rest, and let the marble and the lamplight of a renewed Rome settle slowly around you like the mist that rises in the early morning from the Khyber in its ancient bed. Somewhere in the city, a lamp was being trimmed. You can imagine it if you let yourself. A small clay vessel, oil dark and fragrant, and a careful hand adjusting the wick so that the flame burned low and even, casting a warm circle of amber across a tiled floor. This is the kind of thing that was happening all across Rome in those first quiet months after Actium, in the year we might call 30 before the birth of Christ, and then 29, and then 28, each year unfolding a little more gently than the year before, each morning carrying just slightly less dread than the one that had preceded it. The city was exhaling. It had been holding its breath for so long that the people had almost forgotten the sensation of breathing freely. And now, slowly, tentatively, they were learning it again. And at the center of all this held breath, this long collective sigh, stood a man of 32 who had survived everything, every conspiracy, every battle, every alliance that curdled into enmity, and who now found himself in a position that no one in Rome had occupied before, at least not officially, not in the forms and language that Romans used to give their world its shape and meaning. He was the last man standing, and the question of what to do with that fact would occupy him with extraordinary patience and extraordinary care for the rest of his very long life. He did not call himself king. That word had killed Julius Caesar as surely as any knife. He did not call himself dictator, which had the same sharp smell of danger about it. What Octavian, who was beginning in these years to be known as Augustus, a name of quiet reverence that the Senate would grant him in 27, meaning something close to the consecrated, the set apart, the one touched by augury and divine favor. What Augustus did was far more subtle, and in its subtlety, far more enduring than any mere title could have been. He said with the most carefully composed sincerity that he was restoring the Republic. He said he was returning power to the Senate and the people. He laid down his extraordinary commands and his accumulated authorities as though setting down a burden he was glad to be rid of, and then with equal care he allowed them to be handed back to him, one by one, in forms that were technically traditional, technically legal, and yet added together into something Rome had never quite seen before. This arrangement, this careful, patient fiction that was also, in its own strange way, a truth, is what historians would come to call the Principate, from the Latin word meaning the first citizen, the leading man. Augustus was the princeps, the first among equals, though the equality was largely ceremonial, and everyone who thought carefully about the matter understood this, which made his person sacred and inviolable, and gave him the power to veto virtually anything that moved through the machinery of Roman government. He held a great proconsular command that gave him control over the provinces where the armies were stationed, which is to say, over the armies themselves, while the Senate administered the older, quieter provinces where no legions were needed. He accumulated these powers not all at once but gradually, over years, adding each piece so carefully and so slowly that the whole shape of the thing only became visible in retrospect, the way you do not notice a tide coming in until your feet are already wet. The Senate still met. The election still happened. Consuls were still appointed each year with all the old ceremonies intact, and Romans who wished to climb the traditional ladder of office could still do so, could still speak of their consulship with pride. Augustus was careful to honor all of this, careful to be seen honoring it, careful to stand when elderly senators entered the room, and to use the forms of address that respect required, and to frame every communication with the Senate as a conversation rather than a command. It is said that he once submitted himself to a legal inquiry like any ordinary citizen, standing in the forum and allowing the process to proceed around him, precisely because he wanted it known that he lived inside the law rather than above it. Whether this was genuine principle or exquisite theater, and it may well have been both at once, in a way that only a man of his particular temperament could manage, it worked. It worked for decades. It worked so well that when Augustus finally died, more than 40 years after Actium, the institutions he had built were so smoothly integrated into Roman life that his successor Tiberius would simply step into the same forms and fill them with the same quiet authority. And the Republic would go on not existing while appearing to exist, and the world would not end. There was so much practical work in these years that it is easy, drifting through them at this hour of the night, to lose track of how enormous it was. He reorganized the administration of Rome itself, dividing the city into 14 regions, each with its own local organization, its own small officers, its own sense of belonging to a manageable piece of the vast whole. He established the vigiles, a body of men whose duty it was to watch the city at night against the ever-present danger of fire, and you can see them in your mind if you like, moving through those lamplit streets in the small hours, checking the alleys, noting where a torch burned carelessly close to a wooden beam. He reformed the grain supply that fed the vast population of the city, understanding as clearly as any ruler before or since that hunger is the most reliable destroyer of loyalty. He reorganized the army, fixing the length of service and the amount of the soldiers' pay, and what they could expect when their years of service were complete, land or a sum of money in its place, so that the legions owed their future to the state, rather than to whatever ambitious general happened to be leading them at the time. He wanted no more Antonys, no more circumstances in which a soldier's deepest loyalty ran to a charismatic patron, rather than to Rome. He was not in these years a dramatic figure. He cultivated the opposite. The stories that come down to us, and it is worth remembering that stories filtered across 2,000 years carry their own gentle distortions, suggest a man of deliberate simplicity in his personal habits, living on the Palatine Hill, in a house that was comfortable but not ostentatious by the standards of wealthy Romans, eating plain food, wearing wool that the women of his household had made, going to bed early and waking early, and working through his correspondence with the systematic patience of a man who understood that most of the real work of governing happens not in grand moments, but in thousands of small decisions made carefully and consistently over time. He was often ill, or said to be, and it is true that his health was never robust, and yet he outlived almost everyone, which says something either about the resilience that can hide inside a fragile frame, or about the sustaining power of purpose, or perhaps about both. There was a temple of Janus in Rome, a small and ancient structure, and its doors had been closed, according to tradition, only twice in the whole history of the Republic, in the years when Rome was at peace on every frontier. Augustus closed those doors 3 times in his reign. 3 times the city paused and breathed, and acknowledged that the wars, at least for now, had been set aside. The peace was never absolute, never perfect. There were campaigns in the north and in the east and in the provinces where the edges of the Roman world still needed defining. But there was something real in it nonetheless, something that ordinary people felt in the markets and in the streets and in the homes where children were being born who would grow up having never known civil war, who would learn of Philippi and Actium as stories from another age. The lamp burned on in its quiet corner, steady and even, and casting its amber warmth without drama, the way good order always does when it is working, unremarkable, unthreatening, simply present. And as this long, patient work was settling into its rhythms, as the foundations of something new were being laid beneath the comfortable old surfaces of Republican ceremony, the city itself was changing shape around the man who had changed it. The marble was coming, the gardens were coming, the shaded porticos, and the rebuilt temples, and the long golden evenings beside the Tiber. All of it was coming, slowly and beautifully, and it is there that we will rest together next, wandering through the renewed city as the day grows soft, and the first lamps are lit along the river's edge. For now let the lamp in its corner burn low, let the night settle, let Rome breathe. The lamps of the city are coming on, one by one, as the sun lowers itself behind the Janiculum hill, and the sky above Rome turns the color of warm terracotta, of aged honey, of the inside of a seashell held up to fading light. It happens slowly, this nightly transformation, the way all the most beautiful things in the world happen slowly, without announcement, without hurry. The city simply breathing itself into another shade of itself, as the afternoon releases its hold and the evening comes to take its place. And in this hour, in this particular gilded hour that belongs to the Rome that Augustus has made, there is nowhere on earth quite like it, nowhere that gathers quite so much human beauty into one stone and water place, and lets the light play across it until even the most weary of travelers must stop and simply stand and look. Begin perhaps at the river. The Tiber moves through the city the way it has always moved, with that characteristic muddiness, that particular shade of brown that Romans have always called golden when they are feeling affectionate, and the story goes that in the age of Augustus the riverbanks have been cleaned, ordered, made more navigable, so that the boats that slide along its surface carry their loads of grain and timber and Tyrrhenian wine with something approaching ease. The water catches the last light on its surface and breaks it into slow, shifting pieces, and if you stand on the new paving of the riverbank and watch long enough, you begin to feel the movement of the water in your own chest, that patient, unhurried pulse that the river has kept for longer than any city has existed, longer than any name has been given to the hills that rise around it. Small fishing vessels are being drawn up onto the banks for the night, their hulls wet and dark, and the men who work them are calling to one another in the easy, abbreviated language of people who have spent the day together doing the same thing. And their voices carry across the water and blend with the sound of the river itself, and the whole of it together is nothing more or less than the sound of evening, arriving, walk up from the river, and the city rises to meet you. This is the Rome that Augustus has spent decades building, or rather rebuilding, because the old Rome was there before him, a city of brick and timber and mud plaster and ambition, and what he has done is not erase it, but slowly, carefully, lay marble over its bones until the whole of it glows. He is said to have told those close to him that he found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble. And whether those were precisely the words he used or not, the sentiment is there in every street you walk, every corner you turn, every unexpected flash of white stone catching the late-day sun. Porticos of columns cast long parallel shadows across paved squares as the afternoon wears on, and those shadows are cool and still and smell of stone that has been warming all day in the Italian sun and is now releasing that warmth back into the air, the way stone does, slowly, generously, as though it has been holding the heat in trust all day, and gives it back only when the people need it most, in the cool of the approaching dusk. The Forum of Augustus sits at the heart of this renewed city, and it is a place designed not merely for use, but for something harder to name, something closer to the feeling of being reminded of who you are and where you come from, the long thread of it stretching back through the centuries of the Republic, and further still, back to the mythic founding, back to Aeneas and the burning of Troy, and the promise that was carried westward across the sea. The temple of Mars Ultor stands there, Mars the Avenger, with its columns of white Carrara marble rising to a height that makes you feel appropriately small, appropriately temporary, and yet not diminished, not crushed, but rather placed correctly in the world, given a sense of your own proper scale. The statues in the niches look down with the mild authority of those who have already done everything that will ever be required of them. In the evening light, they seem less like stone and more like presences, as though the marble is merely the outermost layer of something older and warmer that breathes underneath. Move through the porticos and you come eventually to the gardens. There are gardens everywhere in Augustan Rome, tucked behind walls, spilling over terraces, running along the edges of the hills, where the ground flattens enough to allow for planting. And in the homes of those who have enough space and enough money, the garden is the true center of the house, more important in a sense than any room with a roof, because the garden is where the light comes in unfiltered, where the household Lararium's incense mingles with the smell of earth and green growing things, where the sound of water in a small fountain creates exactly the right quality of silence around itself. Even in the humbler parts of the city, where the apartment buildings rise 4 and 5 stories, and the ground floor rooms are dim and close, there are pots on windowsills with herbs and small flowers, little insistences of green against the stone, and the smell of them in the evening air, basil and rosemary and something sweet that is harder to name, drifts down to the street level and mixes with everything else, the bread baking, the lamps being lit, the faint cedar and resin of the joiners' workshops closing up for the night. It is said that the hoopoe birds come to certain gardens in the hills at this hour, just as the light is going, and that their call, which is like a low flute note repeated 3 times, sounds across the sloping terraces of the Palatine and the Esquiline with such unhurried certainty that you feel it in the sternum rather than hearing it through the ears alone. Whether the hoopoes come every evening, or only in the memory of those who recorded them, it is impossible to say, but the story is a beautiful one, and sits well in the evening air of this city, and so let it be true tonight. Let there be hoopoes in the gardens of the Palatine, as the sky deepens from terracotta to rose, to a blue so dark it is almost purple over the eastern hills. The Palatine Hill is where Augustus himself lives, and this too is part of the meaning of his Rome, because he does not live in a palace of extraordinary ostentation, or at least that is the story he tells and the image he maintains, a man of moderate personal habits, a man who eats simple food and sleeps beneath a single blanket and rises early to walk through rooms of appropriate rather than excessive grandeur. His house, they say, has gardens that look out over the city in the evening. and it requires no great effort of imagination to picture him there sometimes, in the quiet hour after the day's business is done, looking out over the rooftops and the smoke and the glimmer of the river. The man who made all of this, standing at a slight distance from it, breathing the night air that smells of stone and laurel, and the far-off saltiness of the sea carried inland on the south wind. The stars come out over Rome with the particular authority that stars have over a city that does not drown them in its own light. Not yet, not in this century, and they come out slowly as they always do. First one, then three, then a dozen, then the whole great tilting scatter of them, the band of the Milky Way faint and cloud-like across the upper dark. The familiar constellations wheeling into their nightly positions with an indifference to human affairs that is, in its way, deeply comforting. The marble of the temples reflects whatever light remains until even that is gone, and then the city settles into the warm, soft darkness of a summer night, lit by oil lamps in windows, by the orange glow of the street corner braziers where the night workers warm their hands, by the occasional procession of torchlight moving through a wider street on its way to some late ceremony or celebration. And through it all, beneath it all, the sound of water, the fountains that Augustus has built and the springs that have fed the city long before he was born, the aqueducts pouring their endless arithmetic of water into basins and troughs, and the long stone channels that carry it to every district, every neighborhood, so that the sound of the city at night is always, underneath everything else, the sound of water moving, of Rome drinking deep from the hills that surround it, patient and endlessly replenishing, the way a lamp replenishes the darkness not by defeating it, but simply by being steadily, warmly, continuously itself. Tomorrow there will be words to attend to, the poets and the builders in the long, slow cultural work of a reign that has decided to measure its ambitions in beauty as much as in stone. But that is for tomorrow, and tomorrow is very far away from here, from this quiet, marble-scented evening, at the edge of sleep. Let the water sound its low note beneath everything. Let the stars keep their ancient positions overhead. Let the lamps burn on, steady and small, in all the windows of the city. Somewhere in the middle years of his reign, when the wars had long since quieted, and the new temples were still pale with fresh-cut marble, Augustus would sometimes walk in the evening through the city he had remade, and it is pleasant to imagine him pausing, just for a moment, just long enough to hear a poet's words drifting from an open doorway, or to watch lamplight pool across a newly carved inscription, and feeling something that was not quite pride and not quite peace, but something softer and more lasting than either, something that had taken the whole of a long life to earn. He had given Rome its marble, as he himself once said, in place of the brick he had found, but the stone was only part of it. What he had also given, or perhaps more honestly what had grown up around him like ivy finding a warm wall, was a flowering of the mind and of language that would outlast every column and every frieze, outlast the empire itself, outlast almost everything that human hands have ever made. The poets were already at work before the piece was fully settled. The ink was already drying on verses that would be read 2,000 years later in lamplight very different from their own, by people who would still feel the warmth coming off the words. Publius Virgilius Maro, the man the world would come to call Virgil, was not young when Augustus's age began to take its shape, but he was exactly the right age, carrying within him the memory of the old republic's suffering and the long accumulated hope for something steadier. He had grown up in the north of Italy, near Mantua, in farming country of green fields and morning mist and the quiet smell of turned earth, and all of that landscape had soaked into him so thoroughly that even when he wrote about heroes and wars and the founding of nations, you could still feel the grass underneath, still hear the water moving through the land. His earlier poems, the eclogues and the Georgics, had already made him famous and beloved. Slow, luminous works that turned the labor of farming into something very close to prayer, that found in bees and vineyards and the turning of the seasons a kind of meaning that no amount of political upheaval could entirely erase. But it was the great epic that consumed the later years of his life, the poem that Maecenas and Augustus both hoped for and encouraged, the poem that would give Rome its founding story, its mythological spine, its sense of destiny stretching backward to Troy and forward to the age of the princeps himself, The Aeneid was this poem. Virgil worked on it for 11 years, it is said, carrying it with him, revising it endlessly, never quite satisfied. And when he died, before it was finished, before he had polished every line to his own exacting standard, he asked that it be burned. And so the poem survived, imperfect by its author's own reckoning, and yet perfect enough to become the heartbeat of Roman literature, the one text that schoolchildren memorized for centuries, the one voice that seemed to carry within it all the weight and wonder of what Rome imagined itself to be. Gaius Maecenas, the great friend and counselor of Augustus, was in many ways the human channel through which this flowering moved. He was not himself a soldier or a magistrate in the old sense. He held no formal office, preferring instead to remain close to Augustus as a trusted advisor and intimate companion. And yet his influence on the cultural life of the age was enormous and unhurried, like water finding its level through many small channels at once. He gathered poets around him with a generosity that was both genuine and deliberately political, understanding, as Augustus also understood, that a city remade in marble needed also to be remade in story, in song, in the long, slow work of meaning-making that only poets can do. His garden on the Esquiline hill, with its baths and its shade and its carefully cultivated calm, became the gathering place of the finest literary minds of the age, and from that garden the poems went out into the world and became part of the air Rome breathed. Quintus Horatius Flaccus, Horace, was perhaps the most beloved of the voices that emerged from those evenings among the lamplight and the conversation. He was a small man, it is said, who liked his wine and his country farm and his own company, and who wrote with a precision and a warmth that made every poem feel like a letter addressed to you personally, to exactly you, at exactly the moment you needed to read it. His odes moved through the great themes: time, friendship, love, the acceptance of mortality, with a lightness of touch that concealed how hard won their wisdom was. He had fought on the wrong side at Philippi, as a young man, as a supporter of the Republican cause, and had come home defeated, had lost his family's land in the resettlements that followed, had built a new life out of necessity and intelligence and a gift for language that nothing could take from him. And what had come out of all that loss and rebuilding was a poetry of extraordinary equilibrium, a poetry that knew exactly how fragile everything was and found beauty in that fragility rather than despair. His great ode, commissioned for the secular games of Augustus, those solemn and magnificent celebrations held in the year 737 from the founding of the city, rang out across the Tiber in torchlight and incense smoke, and the voice of the whole age seemed to be gathered into it, thankful and wondering and quietly aware of how briefly the good moments last. Titus Livius, Livy, as he is known to every generation that has opened his pages, gave Augustus's age not poetry, but history, or rather history written with such care and narrative richness that it moves through the centuries like a great slow river, carrying everything it touches along with it. He spent decades on his monumental account of Rome from its founding, writing volume after volume with a dedication that makes the mind slow and still just to contemplate it. And Augustus is said to have teased him gently for his old Republican sympathies, calling him a Pompeian, but to have kept his friendship and valued his presence all the same. There was room in the Augustan peace for that kind of generous complexity. The past could be honored, even while the present quietly arranged itself into a different shape. And there were others, Ovid, whose wit and elegance and restless intelligence would eventually lead him into the emperor's displeasure and exile, a story that belongs to the sorrows of the later years. Propertius and Tibullus, whose love elegies moved through the world of feeling with a delicacy like lamp flame and still air, and a whole community of scholars, architects, engineers, and craftsmen who contributed to the texture of the age in ways that are harder to name but no less real. The great building program that Augustus and Agrippa oversaw, the temples, the baths, the new Forum of Augustus with its towering walls of white and golden stone, the Areopagus with its exquisite carved processions of figures moving through garlands of acanthus, all of this was a form of expression too, a way of writing in marble and travertine the same things the poets were writing in words, insisting on order and beauty and continuity and the seriousness of the present moment. It was by any measure an extraordinary convergence of talent and time and patronage, the kind of thing that does not happen often in the long span of human centuries. And even knowing how calculated some of it was, knowing that Augustus understood very clearly the political usefulness of poets who praised the age, there is still something genuine at the heart of it, something that cannot be entirely explained by policy or strategy. The poems were too good for that. They had roots that went deeper than any emperor's intentions, down into the grief and hope and honest looking at the world that only real artists manage. The flame that Augustus tended was real, whatever his reasons for tending it, and it burned warm and long and steady through all the decades of his reign. And in the evenings, when the day's business of governing had quieted, and the lamps were lit along the colonnades, and the city settled into its night sounds, the bark of a dog across the Tiber, the low conversation of a supper party somewhere behind a garden wall, the soft knock of a boat against the stone, the age must have felt at least sometimes like something worth having made, worth all the long, difficult, costly work of making. There is a light that good art keeps burning through time, a warmth that reaches forward through the years the way lamplight reaches forward through a dark room, finding walls you did not know were there, illuminating faces, making the night a little more habitable. That is what the poets left behind them in this age, and in the chapters that remain of this long, quiet life, we will find that warmth tested, as warmth always is, by the particular and personal sorrows that no amount of marble and no poem, however perfectly made, can entirely keep at bay. The lamps had been burning for hours in the house on the Palatine Hill, and somewhere in the quiet corridors behind the public rooms, behind the carefully ordered tablinum where Augustus received petitioners and signed documents and wore the face of a man who had everything arranged, there was a grief that no marble could contain, no inscription commemorate, nor triumph soften into something bearable. He had built so much. That is the first thing to hold in mind as we settle into this chapter, as the evening deepens and the flame of the oil lamp pulls gently toward stillness. He had built temples and roads, and a peace that stretched from the cold mists of the Rhine to the warm dust of the Syrian hills. He had given Rome 40 years of something it had almost forgotten how to name: stability, order, the sense that tomorrow would resemble today in its broad and reassuring outlines. And yet the house itself, the actual house, the family that bore his blood and was meant to carry his work forward into the long unfolding centuries, that house cracked and lost its members one by one in ways that no amount of careful arrangement could prevent. And the man who had outmaneuvered every rival, every general, every faction of the old republic, found that he could not outmaneuver this. He could not negotiate with loss. He could not absorb it into a policy. Let us begin with Marcellus, because Marcellus was perhaps the first great wound, and wounds that come early leave the deepest impression in the tissue of a life. Marcus Claudius Marcellus was the son of Augustus's sister Octavia, and there was something about him, a brightness, an ease, a quality that made people turn to watch him pass, that seemed to promise everything. Augustus had chosen him with care and with something that looked very much like love, had given him his only daughter Julia in marriage, had marked him out before all of Rome as the next in the long line of this new order. He was young, perhaps 19 or 20 when he fell ill, in the warm and still months of late summer, and Rome at that time was visited by one of those fevers that move through the crowded districts along the Tiber with a slow and indifferent patience. Agrippa had been unwell the same season and had been sent away to recover, and so it was the court physician Antonius Musa who attended Marcellus, treating him with the same cold water treatments that had so recently saved the life of Augustus himself. And this time, the story goes, the treatment failed. Marcellus died. He was buried in the great mausoleum that Augustus had already built for himself and his family on the banks of the Tiber, that round and imposing monument that now stood waiting, patient as stone always is, for all the others who would follow. Read his great poem aloud to Augustus and Octavia in the months after the loss, and when he reached the lines in the 6th book that spoke of a young man doomed to early death, lines that seemed to conjure Marcellus from the air of the room itself, Octavia fell into a faint, or wept without stopping, depending on which account one follows. Augustus sat very still. That stillness was becoming characteristic in him. He had learned across decades of mortal danger to wear stillness like a second skin. Julia he had raised with great care, and with contradictions that he may never have fully recognized in himself. He wanted her educated. She was, by all accounts, witty and learned and quick, the kind of woman who could hold her own in any conversation, in any room in Rome. And he wanted her controlled, kept within the severe boundaries of what a Roman matron was supposed to be: modest, domestic, a vessel for the continuation of his line. After Marcellus died, she was given in marriage to his old and invaluable general, Agrippa, a man decades older than she was, and she bore him 5 children: Gaius, Lucius, little Agrippa, and 2 daughters, Julia and Agrippina. She was doing what was asked of her, in every practical sense. But the story goes that Julia was also doing other things. She was, according to the accounts that reached Augustus, and that spread through Rome with the particular speed that scandal always travels, conducting herself in ways that violated everything he had made her the symbolic face of. He had passed laws about adultery. He had made fidelity a matter of state concern, had wrapped the moral renovation of Roman family life around his own household, as though it were a physical demonstration of his sincerity. And Julia, his daughter, his only child, the quiet lamp of his private world, however little he may have shown that warmth to her directly, had become the most famous counterexample to everything he preached. The names of the men she was said to have known filled a document he could barely bring himself to read, according to those close to him. One of them was Iulus Antonius, the son of Mark Antony himself, which must have carried its own particular weight of irony, its own private sting. When the matter finally broke into the open, in the year that we count as 2 before the Common Era, Augustus was away from Rome, and the news came to him by letter. He did not return immediately. He could not face it immediately, and when he finally acted, he acted with the cold severity of a magistrate, rather than the complicated love of a father, because perhaps by then he had no other tools left that he trusted. Julia was exiled, not to some comfortable retreat, but to the island of Panditaria, a small and rocky place in the Tyrrhenian Sea, with few comforts and no visitors unless he approved them. Her mother Scribonia, the wife Augustus had divorced decades before, to marry Livia, chose to accompany her daughter into exile, a gesture of loyalty that the histories record quietly, without elaboration. For years Augustus refused to consider any softening of the sentence. Letters came, it is said, from the Roman people asking him to bring her home. He rejected them. He is said to have told someone, in one of those moments of bleak candor that slipped through the composed surface of his public face, that he wished she had died rather than come to this. Whether he truly felt it, or whether it was the anger speaking, no one now can say, but the exile lasted the rest of his life. He eventually allowed her to move to the mainland, to Rhegium in the south, where the conditions were somewhat less severe, but he never permitted her to return to Rome, never permitted himself to see her again. Gaius and Lucius were different in their nature. They were hopes rather than sorrows for most of their young lives. The sons of Julia and Agrippa, they were adopted by Augustus himself, named his heirs, raised in the full light of public expectation, given commands and titles while still very young, sent out to the provinces to learn the craft of governance and war. Gaius went east toward the Armenian frontier and was wounded there in a way that the body never fully repaired. He made his slow way homeward and died at Lamira in Lycia in the early spring of the year we count as 4 of the Common Era. He was not yet 24. Lucius had died 2 years before that, at Massilia in the south of Gaul, of an illness that came quickly. He was 18 when the news of Lucius reached Augustus, and then the news of Gaius reached Augustus. Those who saw him in those seasons spoke of a man who continued to work. He continued to receive visitors and sign documents, and speak carefully about policy, who did all the things he always did, but with something behind the eyes that had changed. A depth, perhaps, an exhaustion that no sleep could reach. He outlived them all. That is perhaps the most quietly devastating fact in all the long account of his long life. He outlived the nephew he had chosen, the sons he had adopted, the dreams he had built around the faces of the young. He had the marble and the order and the peace he had created, and he carried his losses the way the city carried its dead, in stone, in ceremony, in the names inscribed on buildings and porticos in the great theater that bore the name of Marcellus still, and bears it yet. And tonight, as the oil lamp settles into its low and patient burning, it is perhaps right to sit for a moment with that image, the great arranger of the world, sitting still, having lost the people he could not replace, before we let sleep begin its own quiet work, carrying us gently toward the final river and the final crossing that waits just ahead in our telling. The air in Rome had grown heavier in those final years, dense with the particular stillness that settles over a city when the one figure at its center has begun, almost imperceptibly, to slow. Not dramatically, not with any sudden darkening. Augustus had never done anything dramatically, but in the way that a great river, after decades of broad and steady movement, begins to find its banks more quietly, its current more contemplative, as though the water itself has decided that it has carried enough for a while, and might now allow itself simply to flow. He was in his mid-70s by this time, which was, by the reckoning of his world, a span of years that few men reached, and fewer still reached, with their minds unclouded, and their hands still holding the threads of so vast an empire. The Romans had a word for such longevity, earned through effort and endurance. They called it a gift from the gods, or perhaps a burden disguised as one, and Augustus himself seems to have felt both things at once. The story goes that he was fond of saying, in those later years, that he had played his part well enough, using the language of the theater in that gently self-aware way that had always been part of how he held the immense weight of what he had become, without quite appearing to hold it at all. Tiberius was beside him now, his stepson, the man who had spent decades in military service and in patient waiting, solid and somewhat grim and entirely capable, which was what the empire needed, and perhaps what Augustus, with his long eye for such things, had understood it would need. The arrangements had been made carefully, as all of Augustus's arrangements were made, with time and with the kind of quiet thoroughness that leaves nothing important unspecified. There is something in that carefulness that feels tender, in its way, the gesture of a man who had watched enough chaos in his youth to spend the whole of his maturity ensuring that none of it returned after him. He traveled south that summer, the last summer, in the year that we now reckon as the 14th year of the Common Era, which fell in the 37th year of what Rome called his reign, though he himself would have corrected that word with a raised eyebrow and a particular mild smile. He had gone to see Tiberius off at a point of departure. Some accounts say he accompanied him part way toward a journey to the eastern provinces, and the summer heat along the Campanian roads was, as it always was, the thick and golden heat of the Italian south, the kind that settles into stone and brick and the bark of olive trees and radiates back long after the sun has begun to sink. He was not well. He had never been robustly well, this man who had survived civil wars and assassinations and illness after illness across the long arc of his life, always seeming to recover when recovery seemed impossible, so often so that his survival had come to feel like a kind of arrangement with the universe rather than a medical fact. But now the recovery did not come with its old confidence. He grew tired more easily than before, and the accounts that come down to us, written by Suetonius a century later, and by others who gathered what they could of the story, suggest that those around him began to understand, quietly, that this was different. He reached Nola, a town southeast of Naples, where the road curves through low hills, and the air carries the smell of turned earth and distant pine, and it is said that he had a particular connection to this place, that his father had died at Nola decades before, and there is something in that detail that invites a long and quiet thought, the son returning, at the last, to the same soil that had received the father, as though the hills themselves had been waiting patiently across all those intervening years of empire and war and marble. It is said, and Suetonius records it with the kind of careful phrasing that suggests he understood its weight, that in his final hours Augustus asked for a mirror and had his hair combed and his face set right, and that he gathered those who were close to him and asked them whether he had played the comedy of life with sufficient skill. The Greek word he is said to have used comes from the theater, a gentle performance metaphor, and those who were there, Livia among them, Livia almost certainly among them, having been beside him for more than 50 years of this extraordinary life, would have understood what he was doing. He was framing the ending. He was, even now, attending to the shape of the thing. And then it is said that he died quietly, in Livia's arms, or near to her arms. The accounts differ slightly in their particulars, but agree in their atmosphere of gentleness, of a death that came without convulsion, or terror, or the kind of anguish that so many men in the violent century he had lived through had met instead. He asked her, the story goes, to remember their life together, and then the breath simply ceased, in the way that breath sometimes does in a summer room when the air is warm, and the light is the particular amber of a late Italian afternoon, and the great noise of the world outside seems very far away and very small. He was 75 years old. He had been the dominant force in the Roman world for more than 4 decades. He had taken a republic bleeding from its own contradictions, and had shaped it with enormous care and considerable ruthlessness, and a patience that bordered on geological, into something that would hold together more or less for another 2 centuries, and in transformed versions considerably longer than that. He had built in marble. He had made peace after a generation of war. He had watched poets create works that would be read in languages and places that no Roman could have imagined, by people sitting in rooms lit not by oil lamps but by entirely other forms of light. And those works would carry the texture of his world forward, gently, across all that distance. The news traveled through the empire the way news always traveled in that world, by road, by ship, by messenger on horseback, carried in the leather satchels of official couriers, and in the word of mouth of traders and soldiers, moving outward from Nola in rings, the way that a stone dropped into still water sends its circles quietly to every shore. To the frontier soldiers in the north, to the grain merchants of Alexandria, to the olive growers of Spain and the shepherds of Judea, and the quarrymen of the Greek islands. All of them would learn in time that the man who had been the fixed point of their world was no longer in it. And in Rome itself, the city that he had found brick and left, as he had always said, with that particular satisfaction, marble. The people gathered in the forums and the markets and the narrow shaded streets, and looked at one another, with the expression that people wear, when something so constant and so large has ended, that they cannot quite yet take the measure of what comes next. Not grief exactly, or not only grief, but something more like the feeling of standing in a room from which all the furniture has been removed, where the shape of the absence tells you everything about what used to fill it. The Senate would divine him, would make him formally and officially a god, Divus Augustus, adding him to the list of the deified in the old Roman way, and his name would pass from the name of a man into a title, a word that future rulers of Rome and then of other empires and other places would carry, a word that in altered forms would echo forward through centuries, so that even now, in languages he never knew existed, traces of that name remain in common use, embedded in the very way we speak about the turning of the year. But all of that is the world's way of reckoning with such a life, the formal and the institutional and the lasting. The quieter thing, the thing that settles most softly, as you rest here now in your own warm darkness, is simply this, that somewhere on a summer road in the Campanian hills, with the last of the afternoon light lying warm across the stones, and the smell of turned earth rising from the fields beyond the window, and the oil lamp burning low on its stand in the corner of the room, the long life reached its end as gently as a tide withdrawing from a shore it had shaped across a lifetime, leaving everything it had touched a little altered, a little more itself, quietly luminous in the evening air. There is one more drift ahead of you, one last slow movement through this life before it fully settles into sleep. A gentle gathering of everything, the boy, the wars, the marble, the peace, drawn together softly, like embers banked for the night, warm and quietly glowing. The lamps are burning low now, as they always do at the end of a long night, their flames reduced to the smallest, steadiest glow, just enough to see by, just enough to feel that the darkness is not absolute, that something warm and patient is still keeping watch. And it seems right, somehow, to sit quietly beside that last light and let the whole long life of Augustus drift back through the mind, not with urgency, not with the sharp edges of history, but the way a river remembers its own course, the way water always finds its way home to the sea. He began as all lives begin, in a particular and unrepeatable place, the hills of Velitrae, modest and sun-warmed, a provincial town of no great consequence in the wider story of the Roman world, a place where a man of reasonable ambition might raise a family and count himself content. His father, Gaius Octavius the Elder, was that kind of man, careful, decent, not without quality, a man who understood the slow grammar of Roman respectability and lived within it faithfully. And in that house, in that quiet provincial life, a boy was born who would come in time to reshape the world that surrounded him, without ever quite seeming to force the matter, without ever quite seeming to push. That was always his most remarkable quality. The stillness of it, the patience. The great-uncle entered his life gradually, the way a rising tide enters a harbor, almost without announcement, and then suddenly present everywhere. Julius Caesar, who was storm and fire and certainty, looked at the young Octavius and saw something that drew his attention. Something in the boy's composure, in his careful eyes, in the way he listened before he spoke. The bond deepened across years of boyhood and early youth, sealed at last in a will drawn up across the water, in words that would change everything. It is said that Caesar saw in his great-nephew an heir not merely of blood and property, but of something larger, of purpose, of continuity, of Rome itself. And then the storm came, as storms always come, without sufficient warning and with too much consequence. The Ides of March, the Senate chamber, the knives in the hands of men who believed they were saving the Republic. Across the water in Macedonia, a young man of 18 received the news and sat with it and breathed and thought. And then with a quietness that is almost astonishing when you consider what it meant, he decided to go home, to cross the Adriatic, to claim the name and step into the full ferocity of what that name would bring. The sea that carried him was cold and indifferent, the way the sea always is, and the Italy he sailed toward was a place full of danger, full of men who were larger than he was, louder and more battle-hardened, and far more certain of their own supremacy. And yet he went. The name Caesar settled onto him like armor, protective and burdensome in equal measure. The wolves were circling. Antony, who did not want a rival, and especially did not want this particular one, this pale, quiet boy who seemed so easy to underestimate. Lepidus, calculating and watchful. The Senate, which had its own designs, its own desperate hopes for a return to the comfortable certainties of the old order. And the young Octavian moved through all of it with a deliberateness that seems in retrospect almost uncanny. Making alliances and then remaking them, learning the price of power with the careful attention of a student who knows that the examination will not be forgiving. The triumvirate, that cold and necessary arrangement between three men who did not trust one another, produced the proscriptions, lists of names, of lives deemed expendable for the sake of the new order, and this chapter of the story carries its full weight of shadow, as it should. The young Caesar, who would eventually build temples and commission poets, began by signing names onto lists, and that knowledge never entirely leaves the account of his life. Power, he was learning, was not a clean thing. It was never going to be a clean thing. The Fields of Philippi, somewhere in Macedonia, where the last of the Republican assassins were met and defeated, and the Republic in its truest sense breathed its last among the autumn dust. Octavian's part in those battles was complicated, uncertain in its details, perhaps not glorious in the way that a later age would wish. He was ill, it is said, and the record of his precise role is softened by the mists of time and the tenderness of later historians who served his cause. But he was there, and he survived, and survival was itself a form of victory. Then the long middle years, which are not the part of the story that poets sing, but which are perhaps the most remarkable part of all. The wars that would not end. The Perusine conflict, the slow grinding threat of Sextus Pompey on the seas, the fleets burning, the grain routes threatened, Italy hungry and exhausted. And through all of it, Octavian holding the Western world together with a patience that seems almost inhuman, almost architectural in its steadiness. And in those years Livia came and stayed for more than 50 years, a woman of such cool intelligence and such quiet strength that she becomes, in the long view, inseparable from what Augustus made of himself. She was the still water at the center of his life, and whatever the complexities of their story, whatever the rumors and the whispered questions, she was there. She was always there. Antony drifted away as tides drift, not all at once but by degrees. The Eastern campaigns, the long entanglement with Egypt and with Cleopatra, the slow, irreversible widening of the distance between the two men who had once shared the world between them, and at Actium, off the western coast of Greece, on a warm September sea, the question of who would rule Rome was settled with a quietness almost unsuited to its consequences. Ships moving, a withdrawal, a decision made somewhere in the retreating fleet, and then the world was Octavian's, utterly and completely, and there was nothing left to fight. What he did with that world is what we remember. The Principate, that extraordinary invention, the fiction maintained with elaborate and scrupulous care, that the Republic had been restored, that he was merely the first citizen among equals, that the old forms still meant what they once meant, and somehow, through the sheer weight of his patience and his consistency, and perhaps through the exhaustion of a Roman world that had been fighting itself for a century, somehow it held. The marble rose, temples of gleaming white stone replaced the brick and timber of the old city. Virgil wrote the Aeneid, and Horace his odes, and Livy his great history, and the arts flowered in the long, warm light of a peace that seemed, after so much darkness, almost miraculous. There were sorrows, as there are always sorrows in a life long enough to accumulate them. Marcellus, his nephew and his hope, gone too young. Gaius and Lucius, his grandsons, on whom he had placed such careful and perhaps too heavy a weight of expectation, both taken before they could carry it. His daughter Julia, brilliant and restless, exiled to a small island by her own father, a wound that it is said never fully healed. He outlived so many of the people he had loved or needed or planned for, and in the end the succession fell to Tiberius. Steady, competent, not unloved, but also not what he might have chosen, had choosing been simple. And at the last, a journey south along the roads he had done so much to build and maintain toward Nola in Campania, and a room somewhere in that warm southern town, and a death that the story goes was gentle, peaceful even, attended by the woman who had stood beside him for more than half a century. He asked, it is said, whether he had played his part well. He asked for applause, in the old Roman fashion, as though the performance were ending, and the audience were still gathered in the theater of his life. He had played his part. For 40 years of rule, across a life of 75 years, he had held the world together and made something from the wreckage of the Republic that endured, in its various forms, for centuries beyond his own imagining. The boy from Velitrae, the heir across the water, the man who stood beneath the Actian sky, the restorer of temples, the patron of poets, the husband of Livia, the father of exiled Julia, the grandfather who buried too many hopes. All of it drifts together now, the way smoke drifts from a lamp at the end of the night, curling upward and dispersing into the dark, becoming part of the air, part of the room, part of something larger than any single flame. Let it settle. Let the marble and the lamplight in the long Italian evenings settle into the quietest part of your mind, where stories go when sleep finally comes. The fire has burned down to its last soft ember, and you have traveled far enough for one night. Rest now. The world of Augustus is still and golden, and it will be here when you return.